A millionaire decides to pay a surprise visit to his brother-in-law's house, where his sister lives, and has been strangely absent for months. As he enters, he finds his sister kneeling on the floor, silently crying as she scrubs the ground. The millionaire is completely shocked upon discovering what has been happening in that house, and what he decides to do next is truly heart-wrenching. The sleek black Bentley glided to a stop in front of an imposing mansion nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. As the car door swung open, Maxwell Thornton emerged, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the worry etched across his face. At 55, the self-made millionaire had conquered the business world, but today he faced a challenge that money couldn't solve. Maxwell's eyes swept over the manicured lawn and pristine facade of his sister's home. It had been months since he'd last spoken to Catherine, and her recent behavior had him deeply concerned. The usually vivacious and independent woman had become withdrawn, cancelling their weekly dinners and making excuses to avoid family gatherings. As he approached the front door, a sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Something was off. The door stood slightly ajar, a silent sentinel hinting at the turmoil within. Maxwell's hand hesitated on the handle, his mind racing through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. "Catherine," he called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous foyer. No response came, save for the faint sound of muffled sobs emanating from deeper within the house. Following the heart-rending sound, Maxwell made his way through the opulent interior, his footsteps muffled by plush carpeting. Family photos adorned the walls, frozen moments of happiness that seemed to mock the current atmosphere of despair. As he neared the kitchen, the sobs grew louder, punctuated by the occasional scraping sound. Maxwell's heart raced as he rounded the corner, unprepared for the sight that greeted him. There, on the immaculate marble floor, knelt Catherine. Her once impeccable appearance was a distant memory as she furiously scrubbed at a dark stain, her hands raw and trembling. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her makeup and dripping onto the floor, mingling with whatever substance she was so desperately trying to erase. "Kathy," Maxwell breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of the unspoken hanging heavily between them. "Max," she finally choked out, attempting to compose herself. I didn't hear you come in. I was just cleaning up a little spill." Her voice wavered, the lie transparent and fragile. Maxwell knelt beside his sister, gently taking her hands in his. "Catherine, what's going on? Talk to me, please." She averted her gaze, focusing intently on a spot on the floor. "It's nothing really, I've just been a bit clumsy lately. You know how I am." But Maxwell knew better. This was not the confident, vibrant woman he'd grown up with. The Catherine before him seemed diminished somehow, a shadow of her former self. "Where's Richard?" Maxwell asked, referring to Catherine's husband and his business partner. At the mention of her husband's name, Catherine visibly flinched. "He's out. Business meeting, I think. You know how busy he's been with the new acquisition." Maxwell's jaw clenched. He'd never been particularly fond of Richard, but he'd respected his sister's choice and had even brought him into the family business. Now, a creeping suspicion began to take root in his mind. "Catherine, look at me," Maxwell said softly but firmly. When she finally met his gaze, the pain and fear in her eyes nearly broke his heart. "Whatever's happening, you can tell me. I'm here for you. Always." For a moment, it seemed as though Catherine would retreat back into herself. But then, like a dam breaking, words began to pour out of her. "I can't do this anymore, Max," she sobbed, collapsing into her brother's arms. "I'm trapped. He controls everything, the money, the house, even what I wear. I don't know who I am anymore." As Catherine continued to speak, revealing the extent of the emotional and financial abuse she'd endured, Maxwell felt a mixture of guilt and rage building within him. How had he not seen this sooner? How had Richard, a man he'd trusted with his business and his sister, become such a monster? "He makes me sign things, Max," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "Contracts, documents, I don't even know what half of them are. He says it's for the business, for our future, but—" She trailed off, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. In that moment, Maxwell made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice filled with determination. You're coming with me now." Catherine looked up at him, a glimmer of hope breaking through the despair in her eyes. "But Richard, he'll be furious. He'll come after me, after you, after the company." Maxwell helped his sister to her feet, his resolve strengthening with every passing second. "Let him try. Your family, Kathy. Nothing is more important than that. We'll face whatever comes together." As Catherine went to gather her things, Maxwell surveyed the kitchen. The stain on the floor, whatever it was, seemed to mock him, a tangible reminder of his failure to protect his sister. But as he watched Catherine return, a small suitcase in hand and a look of tentative hope on her face, he knew this was just the beginning. They walked out of the mansion together, leaving behind the pristine facade that had hidden so much pain. As they drove away in Maxwell's Bentley, neither spoke, but a silent understanding passed between them. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee, but they would face it together, as family. Little did they know, their departure from the house was just the first step in a journey that would unravel decades of secrets, test the limits of their resilience, and ultimately redefine the meaning of family, loyalty, and justice. The Thornton estate loomed before them, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion set against the backdrop of the Santa Monica Mountains. As Maxwell's Bentley wound its way up the private drive, Catherine gazed out the window, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell glanced at his sister, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. "This is your home now, Kathy, for as long as you need it to be." As they pulled up to the grand entrance, Maxwell's housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, emerged to greet them. Her usually stoic expression softened as she took in Catherine's disheveled appearance. "Miss Catherine, it's so lovely to see you," Mrs. Abernathy said warmly, ushering them inside. "I've prepared the blue guest suite for you. It has a lovely view of the rose garden." Catherine managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. You're very kind." As they made their way through the marbled foyer, Catherine's steps faltered. Maxwell turned to see his sister staring at a large family portrait hanging on the wall. It had been taken years ago at their parents' 40th wedding anniversary. In the photo, Catherine beamed, her arm linked with Richard's, both of them looking young and in love. "I barely recognize her," Catherine said softly, reaching out to touch the image of her younger self. "Where did she go, Max?" Maxwell placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's still there, Kathy. We'll find her again, I promise." After settling Catherine into her room, Maxwell retreated to his study. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him as he poured himself a glass of scotch. He needed to think, to plan their next move carefully. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Mrs. Abernathy entered, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Thornton, I hope you don't mind me speaking freely, but is Miss Catherine in some kind of trouble?" Maxwell sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Abernathy. It seems Richard has been less than kind to her." The housekeeper's eyes flashed with anger. "That no good. I always thought there was something off about him. What can I do to help, sir?" "Just make her comfortable for now," Maxwell replied. "And if anyone comes looking for her—" "She's not here," Mrs. Abernathy finished firmly. "You can count on me, Mr. Thornton." As the housekeeper left, Maxwell turned to his computer. He had work to do. First, he needed to understand the extent of Richard's control over Catherine's finances. A few clicks brought up the company's records, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Over the past year, significant portions of Catherine's inherited shares in the family company had been transferred to Richard's name. The transactions were all legal on the surface, but Maxwell knew his sister would never willingly give up her stake in the family legacy. "What are you up to, Richard?" Maxwell muttered, digging deeper into the financial records. As he delved into the company's accounts, a pattern began to emerge. Small discrepancies, cleverly hidden but unmistakable to Maxwell's trained eye, pointed to a systematic siphoning of funds. Richard wasn't just controlling Catherine, he was bleeding the company dry. A sudden crash from upstairs jolted Maxwell from his investigation. He raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Catherine in her room, surrounded by shattered glass, her eyes wild with panic. "Kathy, what happened? Are you hurt?" Maxwell asked, carefully navigating through the broken shards to reach his sister. Catherine shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was just trying to open the window, but my hands were shaking, and I knocked over the vase. I'll clean it up, I promise. Please don't be angry." Maxwell's heart broke at the fear in her voice. "Oh, Kathy," he said softly, enveloping her in a gentle hug. "It's just a vase. I'm not angry. I'm just glad you're okay." As he held his trembling sister, Maxwell realized the depth of the damage Richard had inflicted. This wasn't just about money or control. Richard had systematically destroyed Catherine's sense of self-worth, leaving her a shell of the vibrant woman she once was. "Listen to me," Maxwell said, pulling back to look Catherine in the eyes. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you or control you ever again. But Kathy, I need to know everything. Every document you signed, every threat Richard made. We're going to fix this, but I need the whole truth." Catherine nodded, wiping away her tears. "Okay," she whispered. "But Max, there's something else you should know. Something I've been too ashamed to tell anyone." As Catherine began to speak, revealing secrets that had been buried for years, Maxwell listened intently. With each word, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place, revealing a picture far more complex and sinister than he had initially imagined. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Thornton estate. In his office downtown, Richard returned from his business meeting, his face darkening as he discovered the empty house and Catherine's hastily scribbled note. Miles apart, two men set their jaws in determination, each preparing for a battle that would shake the very foundations of the empire they had built. And caught in the middle, slowly finding her strength in the sanctuary of her brother's home, Catherine began the long journey of reclaiming her life, unaware of the storms brewing on the horizon, storms that would test the bonds of family, the limits of loyalty, and the true meaning of redemption. The gentle morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Catherine's room, casting a soft glow on her sleeping form. For the first time in months, her face was relaxed, free from the constant tension that had become her companion. As she stirred, the events of the previous day came rushing back, and for a moment, panic gripped her heart. But then she remembered. She was safe, in Maxwell's home. Catherine padded softly to the window, looking out over the meticulously manicured gardens. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray world she'd been living in. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, her voice still rough with sleep. Mrs. Abernathy entered, carrying a tray laden with breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Catherine. I thought you might like to eat in the comfort of your room today." Catherine smiled gratefully, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. That's very kind of you." As the housekeeper set down the tray, her eyes lingered on Catherine's wrist, where a fading bruise peeked out from beneath her sleeve. Catherine quickly tugged the fabric down, but not before Mrs. Abernathy's face darkened with concern. "Miss Catherine," she began hesitantly, "I hope you know that you're safe here. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you just have to ask." Catherine nodded, fighting back tears. "I appreciate that, truly. It's hard to believe this isn't all a dream, that I won't wake up back in that house with him." Mrs. Abernathy reached out, gently patting Catherine's hand. "This is real, dear. And that man won't hurt you again, not if Mr. Thornton has anything to say about it." After Mrs. Abernathy left, Catherine picked at her breakfast, her appetite still diminished from years of stress. As she sipped her tea, her eyes fell on a framed photo on the bedside table, a snapshot of her and Maxwell as children, grinning widely on a beach somewhere. The memory hit her like a wave. It was from their last family vacation before their parents passed away. She'd been 16, Maxwell 21. They'd spent the week building sandcastles, collecting seashells, and staying up late to watch the stars. It was the last time she remembered feeling truly carefree. A lump formed in her throat as she thought of how different her life had become. How had she let Richard isolate her so completely from the people she loved? The shame of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Determined to shake off the melancholy, Catherine decided to explore the house. As she wandered the halls, memories flooded back. Holidays spent here as a child, family gatherings, laughter echoing through the rooms. It felt like stepping back in time to a version of herself she'd almost forgotten existed. She found herself in Maxwell's study, drawn to the warmth and comfort of the space. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and family mementos. On the desk, a framed photo caught her eye. It was from Maxwell's 50th birthday party 5 years ago. Catherine picked it up, studying the faces frozen in time. There she was, standing beside Richard, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Even then, the cracks had been forming, though she'd been too blind to see them. Richard's arm was around her waist, his grip visibly tight, even in the still image. How had no one noticed? "I should have seen it." Maxwell's voice came from behind her, startling Catherine. She turned to find her brother leaning against the doorframe, his face etched with regret. "I'm so sorry, Kathy. I should have protected you." Catherine set down the photo, shaking her head. "It's not your fault, Max. I hid it well. I was ashamed. I thought I could fix things on my own." Maxwell crossed the room, enveloping his sister in a warm embrace. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Richard is the one who should be ashamed, and he will be, I promise you that." As they broke apart, Catherine noticed the dark circles under Maxwell's eyes. "Did you sleep at all last night?" Maxwell shrugged, moving to his desk. "I had some work to do. Kathy, we need to talk about the company, about the documents Richard made you sign." Catherine's stomach churned at the mention of the papers. "I don't even know what half of them were, Max. He would just put them in front of me, tell me it was for our future, for the good of the company. If I hesitated, he'd—" Her voice trailed off, the memory of Richard's anger still too raw. Maxwell's jaw clenched, but his voice remained gentle. "I know it's hard, but I need you to try to remember. Anything you can tell me will help. We need to understand what Richard's been doing, not just to you, but to the company." Catherine nodded, taking a deep breath. As she began to recount what she could remember, Maxwell listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. The more she spoke, the more she realized how deep Richard's deception went. "There was one night," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when Richard came home late. He'd been drinking and he was angry about something at work. He started ranting about how you didn't appreciate him, how he deserved more control in the company. He said he was going to show everyone who really ran things." Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Do you remember when this was?" Catherine thought for a moment. "It was about 3 months ago, I think, just before the Anderson contract was signed." Maxwell's face paled. "The Anderson contract? Kathy, I need to make some calls. Will you be all right on your own for a bit?" Catherine nodded, feeling a mix of relief at having shared her burden and anxiety about what it might mean. As Maxwell picked up his phone, she slipped out of the study, her mind reeling. In the hallway, she paused in front of a large mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, pale, thin, with haunted eyes. But as she stood there, Catherine felt something stirring deep within her, a flicker of the strength she'd thought long extinguished. "Enough," she whispered to her reflection. "It's time to take back control." With newfound determination, Catherine headed back to her room. She had her own calls to make, starting with her old friend Sarah, a lawyer she'd lost touch with years ago. It was time to start rebuilding her life, one piece at a time. As the day wore on, the Thornton mansion buzzed with quiet activity. In his study, Maxwell delved deeper into the company's records, uncovering a web of deceit that went far beyond what he'd initially suspected. And in her room, Catherine began the painful but necessary process of recounting her experiences, preparing to fight back against the man who had tried to break her. Little did either of them know, across town, Richard was making plans of his own. Plans that would shake the very foundations of the Thornton family and test the limits of their newfound unity. The sleek glass and steel edifice of Thornton Enterprises stood as a testament to Maxwell's business acumen, its 50 stories piercing the Los Angeles skyline. But today, as he strode through the lobby, the building felt more like a battleground than a sanctuary. Employees scattered in his wake, sensing the storm brewing behind their CEO's usually calm demeanor. His executive assistant, Jenny, fell into step beside him as he reached the elevators. "Mr. Thornton, "I've rescheduled your meetings for the day as requested," Jenny said, her voice low. "And Mr. Sullivan called again. He's quite insistent on speaking with you." Maxwell's jaw tightened at the mention of Richard's name. "Tell him I'm unavailable. Indefinitely." As the elevator doors closed, Maxwell leaned against the wall, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability away from prying eyes. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, his sister's pain, the potential damage to the company, the betrayal of a man he'd considered family. The ding of the elevator reaching the top floor snapped him back to attention. Maxwell straightened his tie and stepped out, his game face firmly in place. He had a war to wage and he couldn't afford to show weakness. In his office, Maxwell immersed himself in financial reports and legal documents. The more he uncovered, the more his blood boiled. Richard hadn't just been siphoning money, he'd been systematically undermining Maxwell's position in the company, turning board members against him with a whisper campaign of half-truths and manipulated data. A knock at the door interrupted his investigation. "Come in," Maxwell called, not looking up from his computer screen. "Hello, old friend," a familiar voice said, causing Maxwell to freeze. He looked up to find Thomas Blackwood, his longtime rival and CEO of a competing firm, standing in his office. "Thomas," Maxwell said, his voice carefully neutral. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Thomas smiled, a predatory glint in his eye. "Can't an old friend drop by for a chat, especially when he hears whispers of trouble in paradise?" Maxwell leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of calm. "I'm not sure what you've heard, Thomas, but I can assure you everything at Thornton Enterprises is running smoothly." "Come now, Maxwell," Thomas chuckled, taking a seat across from him. "We both know that's not true. Word travels fast in our circles. Your brother-in-law is making quite a stir." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "Whatever game you're playing, Thomas, I'm not interested." Thomas held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No game, I assure you. In fact, I'm here to offer my help." "Your help?" Maxwell scoffed. "And why would you do that?" "Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing Richard Sullivan taken down a peg or two," Thomas replied, his tone suddenly serious. "He's been making moves in my territory using some less than savory tactics." Maxwell studied his rival carefully. Thomas Blackwood was many things, ruthless, cunning, ambitious, but he'd always prided himself on playing by the rules, at least on the surface. If Richard had crossed a line that even Thomas found objectionable. "What exactly are you proposing?" Maxwell asked cautiously. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low. "An alliance of sorts. I have information about Richard's dealings that could be very useful to you. In exchange, I want exclusive rights to the Anderson contract." Maxwell's mind raced. The Anderson contract was a crown jewel, one that Richard had mysteriously managed to secure, despite initial resistance from the client. If Thomas knew something about it. "I'll need to think about it," Maxwell said finally. Thomas nodded, standing to leave. "Don't think too long, old friend. Time is not on your side." He paused at the door, turning back with a somber expression. "And Maxwell, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about your sister. No one deserves what she's been through." As the door closed behind Thomas, Maxwell slumped in his chair. The offer was tempting, but dealing with Thomas Blackwood was like making a deal with the devil. Could he trust him? Did he have a choice? Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Richard Sullivan nursed a whiskey, his handsome features twisted into a scowl. His phone buzzed with another message from his private investigator. Still no sign of Catherine. "Damn you, Maxwell," Richard muttered, downing the last of his drink. He'd underestimated his brother-in-law, a mistake he didn't intend to repeat. A figure slid into the seat next to him, Vanessa, his longtime mistress and confidant. "Any news?" she asked, her voice silky smooth. Richard shook his head. "Nothing yet, but it's only a matter of time." Maxwell can't hide her forever. Vanessa traced a perfectly manicured nail along Richard's arm. "And what about the other matter? The documents?" "Safe," Richard assured her. "For now. But we need to move quickly. If Catherine starts talking, then we'll have to make sure she doesn't," Vanessa said, her tone chilling in its casualness. "I have connections, remember? People who can make problems disappear." Richard looked at her sharply. "No, nothing that extreme. Catherine may be a liability, but she's still my wife, and Maxwell's sister. We need a subtler approach." Vanessa shrugged, signaling the bartender for another round. "Have it your way. But remember, darling, in this game, hesitation is death. You've come too far to lose everything now." As the fresh drinks arrived, Richard raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the fall of the House of Thornton," he said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Back at the Thornton mansion, Catherine sat in the garden, her easel before her for the first time in years. The paints felt foreign in her hands, but as she began to work, a sense of peace washed over her. With each brushstroke, she felt a piece of herself returning. Mrs. Abernathy watched from the kitchen window, a small smile on her face. "That's it, Miss Catherine," she murmured. "You show them what you're made of." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, the players in this high-stakes drama prepared for their next moves. Maxwell, torn between trusting an old enemy and facing Richard alone. Richard, plotting his revenge from the shadows, and Catherine slowly rediscovering her strength, unaware of the storms gathering on the horizon. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. In the world of power, money, and family loyalty, no one would emerge unscathed. But from the ashes of betrayal and deceit, a new future waited to be born, if they were strong enough to claim it. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Maxwell's office as he pored over financial reports, his eyes strained from hours of scrutiny. Coffee cups littered his desk, testament to the sleepless night he'd endured. As he cross-referenced another set of documents, a pattern began to emerge, one that made his blood run cold. "Jenny," he called, his voice hoarse from disuse. His assistant appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "I need you to set up a secure line and get me everything we have on the offshore accounts Richard set up last year." As Jenny hurried to comply, Maxwell leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The web of deceit Richard had woven was more intricate than he'd initially thought. It wasn't just about siphoning money or gaining control of the company. There was something bigger at play. Across town, in a nondescript office building, Richard Sullivan sat across from a man whose very presence exuded danger. Viktor Petrov, a Russian businessman with a reputation for getting things done. No questions asked. "Mr. Sullivan," Victor said, his accent thick, "I hope you understand the gravity of what you're asking. Once we proceed, there's no turning back." Richard nodded, his face a mask of determination. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Petrov, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Maxwell Thornton needs to be neutralized." As the two men hammered out the details of their nefarious plan, neither noticed the cleaning lady who lingered a bit too long outside the door, her ears straining to catch every word. Back at the Thornton mansion, Catherine stood before her easel, brush in hand. The canvas before her was a riot of colors, dark, angry reds giving way to softer blues and greens. As she painted, memories flooded back, both painful and healing. A gentle knock at the door broke her concentration. "Come in," she called, setting down her brush. Mrs. Abernathy entered, a kind smile on her face. "Miss Catherine, there's someone here to see you. Says she's an old friend." Catherine's heart skipped a beat as Sarah Walker stepped into the room. The years melted away as the two women embraced, tears flowing freely. "Oh, Kathy," Sarah whispered, holding her friend at arm's length. "I've missed you so much. When I got your message, I came as fast as I could." As the two friends settled onto a nearby sofa, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Sarah had been her confidant in college before Richard had systematically cut Catherine off from her support network. Now, with Sarah by her side, she felt stronger than she had in years. "Sarah," Catherine began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need your help. There's so much I need to tell you about Richard, about what's been happening." Sarah took Catherine's hands in hers, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm here, Kathy. Whatever you need, whatever it takes, we'll face it together." As Catherine began to recount the years of abuse and manipulation, Sarah listened intently, her lawyer's mind already formulating strategies. By the time Catherine finished speaking, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow across the room. "Kathy," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, "what Richard has done, it's not just abuse, it's criminal. We need to go to the authorities." Catherine's eyes widened in fear. "But Sarah, you don't understand. Richard has connections. He'll find a way to twist things to make it look like I'm the one at fault. Sarah squeezed her friend's hand reassuringly. Not this time. Not with me in your corner. We'll build an ironclad case, Kathy. It's time Richard faced the consequences of his actions. As the two women began to strategize, a sense of hope blossomed in Catherine's chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a fighting chance. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit parking garage, Jenny, Maxwell's assistant, glanced nervously over her shoulder. The man she was meeting stepped out of the shadows. Thomas Blackwood. "You have it?" Thomas asked, his voice low. Jenny nodded, producing a USB drive from her purse. "Everything Mr. Thornton has uncovered about Richard Sullivan's dealings. But sir, if he finds out I've done this..." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry. Your role in this will remain our secret. You're doing the right thing, Jenny. Maxwell may not see it now, but this information in my hands could save not just the company, but him as well." As Jenny hurried away, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The game was changing, and he was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. Back in his office, Maxwell's phone rang. The caller ID made him pause. It was an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Thornton," a heavily accented voice said, "I have information you might find interesting about your brother-in-law's true plans for your company." Maxwell's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "A friend," the voice replied. "Meet me at the old pier in an hour if you want to know the truth. Come alone." The line went dead, leaving Maxwell staring at the phone, his mind racing. Was it a trap, or the key to unraveling the mystery that threatened to destroy everything he held dear? As night fell over Los Angeles, the players in this high-stakes drama moved their pieces across the board. Maxwell, torn between caution and the desperate need for answers. Catherine and Sarah, building a case against a man who had once vowed to love and protect. Richard, sinking deeper into a world of shadows and danger. And watching it all unfold, unseen and unknown, were forces that would soon change the game entirely. The threads of fate were unraveling, leading to a confrontation that would leave no one unscathed. The old pier creaked ominously under Maxwell's feet as he made his way to the agreed meeting point. The salty sea air filled his lungs, a stark contrast to the stuffy confines of his office. His hand instinctively went to the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling the reassuring bulk of the small recording device he'd brought along. As he reached the end of the pier, a figure emerged from the shadows. Maxwell's eyes widened in recognition. "Elena!" he gasped, hardly believing his eyes. "Elena Petrova!" The woman stepped into the dim light cast by a nearby lamppost. Despite the years that had passed, Maxwell would recognize Richard's former secretary anywhere. Her once vibrant features were now etched with worry lines, her eyes darting nervously around the deserted pier. "Mr. Thornton," Elena said, her accent thicker than he remembered. "Thank you for coming. I have something you need to see." With trembling hands, she produced a manila envelope from her bag. Maxwell took it, his mind racing. Eleanor had disappeared without a trace nearly 2 years ago, shortly after Richard had brought her on as his personal assistant. "Eleanor, what's going on? Where have you been all this time?" She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "There's no time to explain everything, but what's in that envelope, it will tell you what you need to know about Richard's plans. And about the real reason I left." Before Maxwell could press her further, Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone's coming. I have to go. Be careful, Mr. Thornton. Trust no one." With that, she melted back into the shadows, leaving Maxwell alone with the mysterious envelope and more questions than answers. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse apartment, Richard paced nervously, a glass of scotch in his hand. Vanessa lounged on the sofa, watching him with a mixture of amusement and concern. "Darling, you're going to wear a hole in that expensive carpet," she purred. "Come, sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping. "It's all falling apart, Vanessa. Maxwell's digging deeper than I anticipated, and now I can't reach Elena. If she's talked..." Vanessa rose gracefully, moving to Richard's side. She took the glass from his hand, setting it aside before wrapping her arms around him. "Shh, my love. We've come too far to falter now. Remember, we still have our ace in the hole." Richard's eyes met hers, a glimmer of hope returning. The offshore accounts? Vanessa nodded, a sly smile playing on her lips. Maxwell may think he's close to the truth, but he has no idea what's really at stake. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. As Richard allowed himself to be comforted by Vanessa's words, neither of them noticed the blinking light on the ornate vase in the corner of the room, a hidden camera, silently recording their every word. Meanwhile, back at the Thornton mansion, Catherine sat in the library, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Sarah worked diligently at a nearby desk, occasionally glancing up to check on her friend. "Kathy," Sarah said gently, breaking the silence, "I think I've found something. These transfer documents, the signatures don't match." Catherine moved to Sarah's side, peering at the papers. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the documents. They were the ones Richard had pressured her to sign late one night, when she'd been too exhausted and afraid to question him. "They're forgeries," Catherine whispered, a mix of relief and anger washing over her. "I forged my signature." Sarah nodded, her expression grim but determined. "This is big, Kathy. With this, we can prove that Richard acted without your consent. It's a key piece of evidence in building our case against him." As the two women pored over the documents, identifying more instances of fraud and manipulation, Catherine felt a spark of her old self returning. The woman who had once been a force to be reckoned with in the business world was re-emerging, ready to fight for justice. In another part of the mansion, Mrs. Abernathy was doing her nightly rounds when she noticed a light on in Maxwell's study. Curious, she approached, only to find Jenny, Maxwell's assistant, hurriedly rifling through his desk drawers. "Miss Jenny!" Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed, causing the younger woman to jump. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour?" Jenny's face paled, her eyes darting to the window as if considering escape. "Mrs. Abernathy, I can explain. It's not what it looks like." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, years of loyalty to the Thornton family kicking in. "I think you'd better start explaining, young lady. And it had better be good." As Jenny began to stammer out an explanation, neither woman noticed the shadowy figure watching from the garden below, a camera with a powerful zoom lens capturing every moment of the confrontation. Back at the pier, Maxwell had retreated to his car, the envelope from Eleanor clutched tightly in his hand. With shaking fingers, he opened it, spilling its contents onto the passenger seat. Photos, documents, and a USB drive tumbled out. As Maxwell began to sift through the evidence, his eyes widened in shock. The photos showed Richard in clandestine meetings with known criminals. The documents detailed a complex money laundering scheme that went far beyond simple embezzlement. And the USB drive, Maxwell plugged it into his laptop, his heart pounding. As the files loaded, a video began to play. Richard's face filled the screen, his expression cold and calculating. "If you're watching this, Maxwell," Richard's recorded voice said, "then you're closer to the truth than I hoped you'd get. But let me be clear, you have no idea how deep this goes. Back off now, or I'll be forced to take drastic measures. And trust me, you don't want to see how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine." The video ended, leaving Maxwell staring at the blank screen, his mind reeling. The game had changed. What had started as a family crisis had escalated into something far more dangerous and far-reaching than he could have imagined. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city, the players in this high-stakes drama found themselves at a crossroads. Maxwell, armed with damning evidence but unsure who to trust. Catherine, rediscovering her strength and preparing for the fight of her life. Richard, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. And watching from the shadows, unseen forces prepared to make their move. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the Thornton Empire and change their lives forever. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to paint the Los Angeles skyline when Maxwell Thornton's car pulled into the underground parking garage of Thornton Enterprises. His eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night spent poring over Elena's documents, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. As he stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, Maxwell was met by a frantic Jenny. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice hushed and urgent. "There's something you need to know. Last night I did something I shouldn't have." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "My office. Now." Once inside, Jenny's composure crumbled. I gave information to Thomas Blackwood, she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. He said it was to help you to save the company. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm not so sure. Maxwell sat heavily in his chair, the weight of this new betrayal settling on his shoulders. Jenny, do you have any idea what you've done? Before Jenny could respond, Maxwell's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check your email. Time is running out. With a sense of foreboding, Maxwell opened his inbox. There, waiting for him, was a video file. He clicked play, and Richard's face filled the screen. "Hello, brother," Richard's recorded voice sneered. "By now you've probably pieced together some of what's going on. But let me assure you, you've only scratched the surface. I have allies you couldn't begin to imagine, resources you can't comprehend. Back off now, or I'll be forced to take action that will destroy not just you, but everything and everyone you care about." The video ended with a countdown clock. 48 hours. Across town, in a sleek, high-rise apartment, Thomas Blackwood reviewed the information Jenny had provided. A slow smile spread across his face as he realized the leverage he now held. "Oh, Richard," he murmured to himself, "you've overplayed your hand this time." Thomas picked up his phone, dialing a number from memory. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I think it's time we move to phase 2. Meanwhile, at the Thornton mansion, Catherine and Sarah were deep in strategy mode. The dining room table was covered in legal documents, financial records, and hastily scribbled notes. "With the evidence of the forged signatures," Sarah said, tapping a stack of papers, "we have a solid foundation for our case. But Kathy, we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time Richard has to cover his tracks." Catherine nodded, a newfound determination in her eyes. "I'm ready, Sarah. I've been silent for too long. It's time to take back control of my life." As if on cue, Catherine's phone chimed with a text message. Her face paled as she read it. "What is it?" Sarah asked, concern etching her features. Catherine turned the phone so Sarah could see. It was a photo of Catherine and Sarah in the dining room, clearly taken from outside the house. Beneath it, a chilling message. "Careful who you trust, dear wife. Not everyone is on your side." Sarah immediately sprang into action, drawing the curtains and checking the locks on the windows. "We need to call Maxwell," she said firmly. "This has gone beyond legal maneuvering. You're not safe here." As Sarah reached for her phone, a gentle knock at the door made both women jump. Mrs. Abernathy entered, her usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Miss Catherine, Mrs. Walker," she said, wringing her hands, "I'm afraid we have a situation. There's a man at the gate claiming to be from Child Protective Services. He's asking about Mr. Thornton's children." Catherine and Sarah exchanged bewildered looks. "But Maxwell doesn't have any children," Catherine said, confusion evident in her voice. Mrs. Abernathy nodded gravely. "Exactly, miss. I think it might be an attempt to get into the house." As the implications of this new threat sank in, Catherine felt a surge of anger replace her fear. "No more," she said, her voice steely with resolve. "I'm done being a victim. It's time to fight back." While the women formulated a plan across the city, Richard Sullivan paced in his office, anxiety etched on his usually composed face. Vanessa watched him from the couch, a mixture of concern and calculation in her eyes. "Darling," she purred, "you're going to wear a hole in that expensive carpet. Come, sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his facade of control crumbling. "It's all falling apart, Vanessa. Maxwell's digging deeper than I anticipated. Catherine's found her backbone, and now I can't reach our man inside the SEC. If he talks..." Vanessa rose gracefully, moving to Richard's side. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Listen to me, Richard. We've come too far to falter now, remember. We still have our trump card." Richard's eyes widened in realization. "The offshore accounts?" Vanessa nodded, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Maxwell may think he's close to the truth, but he has no idea what's really at stake. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. Now make the call." With trembling fingers, Richard dialed a number he'd sworn never to use. When a gruff voice answered, he took a deep breath and said, "It's time. Activate Operation Checkmate." As Richard ended the call, neither he nor Vanessa noticed the small blinking light in the potted plant by the window, a hidden camera capturing their every word and move. In a dimly lit room filled with monitors, Elena Petrova watched the scene unfold, her heart racing. She turned to the man beside her, his face hidden in shadow. "We have it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The final piece of evidence we need." The man nodded, stepping into the light to reveal the weathered face of a veteran FBI agent. "Good work, Elena. It's time to bring them all down. Make the call to Thornton. It's time he knew the whole truth." As night fell over Los Angeles, the players in this high-stakes game moved their pieces across the board, each believing they held the upper hand. But as the shadows lengthened and secrets threatened to spill into the light, one thing became clear. Before this was over, no one would emerge unscathed. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the Thornton Empire, and in the process redefine the meaning of family, loyalty, and justice. The Thornton Mansion, once a sanctuary of wealth and privilege, now felt like a fortress under siege. Catherine stood at the window of her bedroom, watching as additional security personnel patrolled the grounds. The man claiming to be from Child Protective Services had been turned away, but the incident had left everyone on edge. A soft knock at the door pulled Catherine from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning to see Sarah enter, a grim expression on her face. "I just got off the phone with my contact at the DA's office," Sarah said, her voice low. "Kathy, they're building a case against Richard, but they need more. They need you to testify." Catherine felt a flutter of fear in her chest, quickly replaced by steely resolve. "Then that's what I'll do. It's time to end this, Sarah. For good." As the two women began to discuss strategy, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Her breath caught as she saw the caller ID. Elena Petrova. "Elena?" Catherine answered, her voice a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Where are you? What's going on?" "Mrs. Thornton." Elena's accented voice came through tight with urgency. "I don't have much time. You and Mr. Maxwell need to be careful. Richard's plans. They're bigger than you know. There are people involved, powerful people. I'm trying to help, but..." The line suddenly went dead. Catherine stared at the phone, her mind racing. "Sarah," she said, turning to her friend, "I think it's time we brought Maxwell fully into the loop. Whatever's happening, we need to face it together." Across town in the opulent offices of Thornton Enterprises, Maxwell sat behind his desk, the weight of recent revelations pressing down on him. Jenny hovered nervously nearby, still shaken from her confession. "Mr. Thornton," she began hesitantly, "what are we going to do about Thomas Blackwood? If he uses that information..." Maxwell held up a hand, silencing her. "One problem at a time, Jenny. Right now we need to focus on Richard. Have you managed to decrypt those files from the USB drive?" Before Jenny could answer, Maxwell's private line rang. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize. With a sense of trepidation, he answered. "Mr. Thornton," a gruff, unfamiliar voice said, "my name is Agent Carlson, FBI. We need to talk in person. Your office, 1 hour." The line went dead before Maxwell could respond. He sat back, his mind whirling. The FBI. How deep did this rabbit hole go? Meanwhile, in a luxurious penthouse across the city, Richard paced nervously, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled. Vanessa watched him with growing concern. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice honey-sweet but with an underlying edge, "you need to pull yourself together. We're too close to lose control now." Richard rounded on her, his eyes wild. "Control? Vanessa, don't you see? We're losing control." Maxwell's closing in. Catherine's found her spine, and now the FBI is sniffing around. It's all falling apart. Vanessa rose gracefully, moving to pour them both a drink. "Then perhaps it's time we played our final card," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes glittering dangerously. "Operation Checkmate isn't just about money, remember? It's about power. And sometimes, to gain power, you have to be willing to burn it all down." Richard took the offered drink, downing it in one gulp. "You're right," he said, a new resolve hardening his features. "Make the call. It's time to set everything in motion." As Vanessa reached for her phone, a shadow passed by the window, a movement so quick it might have been imagination. But in the building across the street, a figure lowered a high-powered camera, speaking quietly into a comm link. "Target is making a move. Operation Sunlight is a go. I repeat, Operation Sunlight is a go." Back at the Thornton mansion, Catherine and Sarah had just finished bringing Maxwell up to speed via a secure video call when Mrs. Abernathy burst into the room, her usual composure shattered. "Miss Catherine," she gasped, "you need to see this. It's all over the news." Catherine rushed to the television, flicking it on to see a breaking news banner scrolling across the screen. "Thornton Enterprises under federal investigation. CEO Maxwell Thornton implicated in massive fraud scheme." As the newscaster began detailing allegations of embezzlement, money laundering, and corporate espionage, Catherine felt the room spin. This was Richard's endgame, to bring down not just Maxwell, but the entire Thornton legacy. "We need to move now," Sarah said, already gathering their documents. "If Richard's playing this card, he's desperate. This might be our only chance to turn the tables." Catherine nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "You're right, but we're not just going to defend ourselves. It's time we took the fight to him." As storm clouds gathered over Los Angeles, the players in this high-stakes drama prepared for their final moves. Maxwell racing against time to meet with the FBI and clear his name. Richard and Vanessa setting in motion a plan that threatened to destroy everything in its path. And Catherine stepping out of the shadows to reclaim her life and save her family's legacy. In a hidden room filled with monitors and humming computers, Elena Petrova and Agent Carlson watched the chaos unfold. "It's time," Carlson said, his voice grave. "Send the signal. All units move in." Elena nodded, her fingers flying over a keyboard. As she hit the final key, a single word flashed across every screen: Endgame. The storm that had been brewing for so long was about to break, and in its wake, nothing would ever be the same. The Thornton Empire, built over generations, now stood on the brink of either salvation or utter ruin. And as the first raindrops began to fall on the city below, the final act of this gripping saga was about to begin. The Thornton Enterprises boardroom, once a bastion of corporate power, now resembled a war room. Maxwell sat at the head of the table, his usual composure strained but not broken. Around him sat a mix of allies and potential foes: his legal team, key board members, and, most surprisingly, FBI agent Carlson. "Gentlemen, ladies," Maxwell began, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "I know you all have questions. I'm here to provide answers, and to assure you that Thornton Enterprises is not only innocent of these allegations, but is in fact the victim of a complex and malicious attack." As Maxwell laid out the evidence they had gathered, the forged documents, the money trail leading to offshore accounts, the video threats from Richard, the room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to shock, and finally, to anger. "This is outrageous," exclaimed board member Harrison, his face flushed. "How could Richard Sullivan have orchestrated all this right under our noses?" Agent Carlson leaned forward, his weathered face grim. "Mr. Sullivan didn't act alone. Our investigation has uncovered links to international criminal organizations. This goes far beyond corporate espionage." A hush fell over the room as the implications sank in. Maxwell used the moment to press his advantage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a chance not just to clear our names, but to strike a blow against corruption on a global scale. But I need your full support. Are you with me?" One by one, the board members nodded their assent. As the meeting adjourned, Maxwell felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. Across town, in the lavish penthouse that had become both sanctuary and prison, Richard Sullivan paced like a caged animal. Vanessa watched him warily, her usual poise showing cracks of concern. "Richard, darling," she said, attempting to soothe him, "you need to calm down. Panic will only lead to mistakes." Richard whirled on her, his eyes wild. "Calm down? Vanessa, it's all falling apart. Our inside man at the SEC has gone silent. The offshore accounts are being flagged, and now I'm hearing whispers that the FBI is involved. We need to run now." Vanessa's eyes hardened, a steely resolve replacing her concern. "No, we've come too far to run now. It's time for our final play." She reached for her phone, dialing a number from memory. "It's me," she said when the line connected. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Yes, all of it. It's time to burn it all down." As Vanessa ended the call, a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Don't worry, darling. By this time tomorrow, the Thornton Empire will be in ashes, and we'll be sipping cocktails on a beach far, far away from here. Meanwhile, at the Thornton mansion, Catherine sat in the study, surrounded by a team of lawyers and financial experts. Sarah Walker stood beside her, a comforting presence in the storm of activity. "Mrs. Thornton," one of the lawyers said, his tone respectful but urgent, "your testimony is crucial. With your statement and the evidence we've gathered, we can not only exonerate your brother, but bring Richard Sullivan to justice." Catherine nodded, a mix of determination and fear coursing through her. "I understand. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." As the team continued to prepare for the upcoming legal battle, Mrs. Abernathy entered the room, her face pale. "Miss Catherine, there's something you need to see." She turned on the television, where a breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she saw Richard's face, looking haggard but defiant. "My fellow citizens," Richard's voice rang out, "I come to you today as a whistleblower, a man who can no longer stay silent in the face of corruption. The Thornton family, led by Maxwell Thornton, has been engaged in a decades-long scheme of fraud, money laundering, and exploitation." As Richard continued his tirade, spinning a web of lies that contained just enough truth to be dangerous, Catherine felt a surge of anger replace her fear. "Enough," she said, her voice quiet but filled with steel. "It's time to end this. Sarah, call Maxwell. Tell him to meet us at the TV station. We're going to set the record straight once and for all." As Catherine and her team prepared to leave, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of reporters and photographers gathering at the gate, their cameras flashing like lightning in the growing dusk. "Mrs. Abernathy," Catherine said, turning to the loyal housekeeper, "I need you to do something for me. In the safe in Maxwell's study, there's a red envelope. Bring it to me, please." As Mrs. Abernathy hurried to comply, Sarah looked at Catherine quizzically. "Cathy, what are you planning?" Catherine's eyes gleamed with a mixture of determination and something else, a spark of the fierce, independent woman she had once been. "Insurance, Sarah, and maybe, just maybe, our ace in the hole." Across the city, in a nondescript van filled with surveillance equipment, Elena Petrova and Agent Carlson monitored the unfolding events. "Here it's all coming to a head," Carlson muttered, his eyes flicking between multiple screens. "Sullivan's made his move. Now it's the Thorntons' turn." Elena nodded, her fingers flying over a keyboard. "I'm tracking unusual activity in several offshore accounts linked to Sullivan. It looks like they're preparing for a massive transfer." Carlson's jaw tightened. "We can't let them get away. Not with everything we've uncovered. It's time to move. Send the signal." As Elena activated a series of encrypted communications, the city of Los Angeles seemed to hold its breath. In boardrooms and backrooms, in mansions and hidden safe houses, the players in this high-stakes drama prepared for their final moves. The storm that had been brewing for so long was about to break, and in its wake, the fate of the Thornton Empire and the lives of all those caught in its orbit would be decided. Little did they know, the biggest revelation was yet to come. A truth so shocking it would redefine everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the true nature of power. The Los Angeles skyline glittered in the fading light as Catherine Thornton's car sped towards the television station. Beside her, Sarah pored over documents on a tablet, occasionally murmuring updates to the legal team following in another vehicle. "Are you sure about this, Cathy?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. "Once we go public, there's no turning back." Catherine's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I've been silent for too long, Sarah. It's time the world knew the truth, all of it." As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Catherine caught sight of Maxwell's car already there. A sense of solidarity washed over her. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a family. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Producers and technicians rushed about, preparing for what promised to be the most explosive live broadcast in recent memory. In a quiet corner, Maxwell conferred with Agent Carlson, their faces grim. "Mr. Thornton," Carlson said, his voice low, "once you go on air, Sullivan will know we're on to him. He'll make his move. Are you prepared for the consequences?" Maxwell nodded, a steely resolve in his eyes. "We've come too far to back down now, Agent. Whatever Richard throws at us, we'll handle it." As Catherine and Sarah entered, a hush fell over the room. The siblings locked eyes, years of unspoken pain and regret passing between them in an instant. Then, moving as one, they embraced. "Together?" Maxwell asked softly. "Together," Catherine affirmed. Across town, in his luxurious penthouse, Richard Sullivan watched the preparations unfold on multiple screens, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Vanessa lounged nearby, outwardly calm, but with tension evident in every line of her body. "This is it, Richard," she said, her voice silky smooth. "Our last chance. Are you ready to play your final card?" Richard's hand shook slightly as he reached for a glass of scotch. "Do it," he growled. "Initiate the transfers. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll be long gone." Vanessa smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye as she picked up her phone. But before she could dial, a commotion outside the door caught their attention. The sound of splintering wood was followed by shouts and the unmistakable declaration, "FBI, freeze." In the television studio, the red light blinked on, signaling they were live. Catherine and Maxwell sat side by side, united in purpose. "Good evening," Maxwell began, his voice steady. "We come to you tonight to address the allegations that have been made against Thornton Enterprises and our family." As Maxwell laid out their side of the story, methodically debunking Richard's claims with hard evidence, Catherine prepared herself for what was to come. When Maxwell finished, all eyes turned to her. Taking a deep breath, Catherine began to speak. She told her story of the years of abuse, of Richard's manipulation and control, of the forged documents and stolen shares. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, the weight of secrets finally lifting from her shoulders. But it was what came next that sent shockwaves through the studio and living rooms across the city. "There's more," Catherine said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Something not even my brother knows." She reached into her bag, pulling out the red envelope Mrs. Abernathy had retrieved from the safe. "This contains evidence of a conspiracy that goes beyond Richard Sullivan, beyond even Thornton Enterprises. It implicates some of the most powerful people in this city, in this country." As Catherine began to detail the contents of the envelope, offshore accounts, secret deals, evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government and industry, the studio erupted into chaos. Producers frantically tried to cut the feed, but found themselves locked out of the system. In the hidden van, Elena Petrova allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "Signal jamming successful," she reported to Agent Carlson. "They're still broadcasting." Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Richard and Vanessa found themselves in handcuffs, watching helplessly as Catherine's revelations unfolded on screen. "You fool," Vanessa hissed at Richard. "You never knew, did you? You were just a pawn in a much bigger game." Richard's face drained of color as the full implications of Catherine's words sank in. He turned to the FBI agent nearest him, desperation in his eyes. "I want to make a deal," he blurted out. "I'll tell you everything I know about the offshore accounts, about the people involved. Just protect me from them." Back in the studio, as Catherine finished speaking, a stunned silence fell. It was broken by the sound of Maxwell's phone ringing. He answered, listened for a moment, then turned to the cameras, his face a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I've just been informed that Richard Sullivan has been taken into custody. But more importantly, based on the evidence my sister has presented, arrests are currently being made across the city and the country. This goes far beyond a family feud or corporate espionage. What we've uncovered here tonight is nothing short of a revolution in the fight against corruption." As the full impact of the night's events began to sink in, Catherine reached out, taking Maxwell's hand in hers. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, of rightness. Outside the studio, crowds had gathered, their faces illuminated by the glow of smartphones as they watched the broadcast unfold. In living rooms and bars across the city, people sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. And in a small, nondescript office, Thomas Blackwood watched the broadcast with a mixture of admiration and calculation. "Well played, Thorntons," he murmured. "Well played indeed. But the game's not over yet." As dawn broke over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city, the landscape of power had shifted irrevocably. The Thornton siblings had reclaimed their legacy, but at a cost they were only beginning to understand. And lurking in the shadows, new threats and challenges awaited, for in the world of power and privilege, the game never truly ends. The storm had passed, but the aftermath promised to be just as tumultuous. For Catherine, Maxwell, and all those caught in the wake of their family's saga, this was not an end, but a new beginning, one fraught with both peril and promise. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thornton mansion as Catherine stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The events of the past 24 hours played on a loop in her mind, each revelation and confrontation leaving her both exhausted and exhilarated. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning to see Maxwell enter, looking as weary as she felt. "How are you holding up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Catherine managed a small smile. "I'm okay, I think. It's all still sinking in. How about you?" Maxwell ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've been better. The phone hasn't stopped ringing since we left the studio. Reporters, shareholders, government officials, everyone wants answers." "And Richard?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In custody," Maxwell replied, his tone grim. "Along with Vanessa and several others implicated in the documents you revealed. The FBI is calling it one of the biggest corruption busts in recent history." Catherine nodded, a mix of emotions washing over her. Relief, vindication, but also a lingering sadness for what could have been. "I never wanted it to come to this, Max. I just wanted—" "I know," Maxwell said softly, pulling his sister into a comforting embrace. "But you did the right thing, Kathy. You saved not just our family, but countless others who were being exploited by this conspiracy." As they stood there, drawing strength from each other, Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, her usually stoic demeanor tinged with excitement. "Mr. Thornton, Miss Catherine," she said, "you might want to come downstairs. There's something you need to see." Curious, the siblings followed her to the study, where the large TV was tuned to a news channel. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made them both gasp. "Global corruption ring exposed, arrests made across 3 continents." The newscaster's voice filled the room. In a stunning development following last night's revelations by Catherine Thornton, law enforcement agencies around the world have launched coordinated raids, targeting individuals and organizations implicated in a vast network of financial crimes and corruption. As they watched, images flashed. Across the screen, politicians being led away in handcuffs, offices being raided, documents seized. The scale of what they had uncovered was staggering. "My God," Maxwell breathed, sinking into a nearby chair. "Kathy, do you realize what you've done? This is bigger than anything we could have imagined." Catherine nodded, her mind reeling. "I knew the documents were important, but Max, what happens now?" Before Maxwell could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his eyebrows shot up. "It's the Attorney General," he said, his voice tight with surprise. As Maxwell took the call, stepping out of the room for privacy, Catherine turned back to the TV. The news had shifted to showing crowds gathering outside Thornton Enterprises, holding signs of support and chanting her name. "Miss Catherine," Mrs. Abernathy said gently, "there are quite a few reporters at the gate. They're asking for a statement." "What would you like me to tell them?" Catherine took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. The timid, controlled woman she had been under Richard's thumb was gone. In her place stood someone new, or perhaps someone rediscovered, someone strong, someone ready to face whatever came next. "Tell them I'll be down shortly," she said, her voice firm. It's time to face the world. As Catherine prepared to address the media, across town in a holding cell, Richard Sullivan sat with his head in his hands. The magnitude of his downfall was still sinking in. A guard approached, unlocking the cell door. "Sullivan," the guard said gruffly, "your lawyer's here." Richard looked up, expecting to see his usual legal team. Instead, he was met with the stern face of Sarah Walker. "Mrs. Walker," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I wasn't expecting—" "Save it, Richard," Sarah cut him off, her tone icy. "I'm not here as your lawyer. I'm here on behalf of Catherine." Richard's eyes widened. "Catherine? But why would she—" Sarah pulled out a document from her briefcase. "She's offering you a deal. In exchange for your full cooperation with the authorities and a complete confession, she's willing to speak on your behalf at sentencing. It won't keep you out of prison, but it might make the difference between a life sentence and the possibility of parole. Richard stared at the document, his mind racing. This was his wife, the woman he had controlled and abused for years, offering him a lifeline. The irony was not lost on him. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything I've done, why would she do this?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Because despite everything, she still believes in redemption. This is your last chance, Richard. I suggest you take it." As Richard pondered the offer that could determine his fate, back at the Thornton mansion, Catherine stepped out onto the front steps. A sea of cameras and microphones greeted her, the air buzzing with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, Catherine began to speak. "Good morning. I stand before you today, not just as Catherine Thornton, but as a voice for all those who have suffered in silence, who have been victims of abuse and corruption." Her words, strong and clear, carried across the assembled crowd and into living rooms around the world. As she spoke of healing, of justice, and of the long road ahead, a new chapter in the Thornton saga began to unfold. Inside the house, Maxwell watched his sister with a mixture of pride and awe. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Washington. The aftermath of their revelations was still unfolding, promising challenges and opportunities they had yet to fully comprehend. As Catherine's speech drew to a close, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the scene. It was a new day, not just for the Thorntons, but for a world that had been irrevocably changed by the courage of one woman who refused to be silenced. 2 weeks had passed since the night that changed everything. The Thornton mansion, once a gilded cage for Catherine, now buzzed with activity. The library had been transformed into a command center, with lawyers, PR specialists, and financial advisors coming and going at all hours. Catherine sat at the head of the large oak table, poring over documents. The woman who had once shrunk from confrontation now exuded quiet confidence as she led a meeting with the board of Thornton Enterprises. "Gentlemen, ladies," she addressed the group, her voice clear and authoritative, "I understand your concerns about the company's stability in light of recent events. But I assure you, Thornton Enterprises is not just surviving. We're on the brink of a new era of growth and ethical leadership." As Catherine outlined her vision for the company's future, Maxwell watched from the doorway, a proud smile on his face. His sister's transformation never ceased to amaze him. The meeting adjourned, and the board members filed out, many stopping to shake Catherine's hand or offer words of support. As the last of them left, Maxwell entered the room. "Impressive, sis," he said, giving her a playful nudge. "You've got the meeting out of the palm of your hand." Catherine laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Hardly, but I think they're starting to see that there's a way forward, a way to turn this crisis into an opportunity." Maxwell nodded, his expression turning serious. "Speaking of opportunities, I just got off the phone with Senator Hawkins. The Senate committee wants us to testify next month about the corruption we uncovered." Catherine's eyes widened. "Both of us?" "Yes," Maxwell confirmed. "Your story, Kathy. It's become a symbol. People see you as a hero, someone who stood up to abuse and corruption and came out stronger." Catherine shook her head, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "I'm no hero, Max. I just did what I had to do." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," a new voice chimed in. Sarah Walker entered the room, a stack of files under her arm. "Sorry to interrupt, but I have some updates on the legal front." As Sarah began to outline the progress of the various cases stemming from their revelations, Catherine's phone buzzed with the news. Alert. She glanced at the screen and gasped. "Max, Sarah, look at this," she said, turning the phone so they could see. The headline read, "Richard Sullivan agrees to full cooperation in corruption probe." Maxwell let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Your offer actually worked." Catherine nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing over her. "It's a start," she said softly. "A chance for some real answers, and maybe some healing." As the three of them discussed the implications of Richard's cooperation, Mrs. Abernathy entered with a tray of coffee and a worried expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's a Mr. Blackwood here to see you. He's quite insistent." Maxwell and Catherine exchanged glances. Thomas Blackwood had been suspiciously quiet since the night of the revelations. "Show him in," Maxwell said, his voice tight. Moments later, Thomas Blackwood strode into the room, impeccably dressed as always, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "Maxwell, Catherine," he greeted them smoothly. "I must say, you two have been the talk of the town. Quite the show you put on." "Cut to the chase, Thomas," Maxwell said, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want?" Blackwood's smile widened. "Want? My dear Maxwell, I'm here to offer you something. A partnership of sorts." He pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to Catherine. "Inside, you'll find a proposal. In light of recent events, there's a gap in the market, a need for a new kind of financial institution, one built on transparency and ethical practices. I believe that together we could fill that gap." Catherine opened the folder, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "This is ambitious," she said carefully. "It's an opportunity," Blackwood countered, "to not just rebuild your family's legacy, but to reshape the entire industry. Think about it. The Thornton name, combined with my resources and connections, we could change the world." As Catherine and Maxwell exchanged thoughtful glances, Sarah cleared her throat. "If you're serious about this, Mr. Blackwood, any partnership would need to be thoroughly vetted. Given recent events, I'm sure you understand our caution." Blackwood nodded, seemingly unfazed. "Of course, I would expect nothing less. Take your time, review the proposal. I think you'll find it intriguing." With that, he turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Catherine, for what it's worth, I always knew you were the real strength in the Thornton family. I look forward to seeing what you do next." As the door closed behind him, the room fell into contemplative silence. The proposal on the table represented yet another crossroads, another decision that could shape not just their future, but potentially the future of the entire financial world. "What do you think?" Maxwell asked, turning to Catherine. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. I think we need to consider it carefully. But Max, if this is legitimate, if we could really make a difference." Maxwell nodded, understanding her unspoken thoughts. "It's a big if, Kathy. But then again, we've already done the impossible. Why stop now?" As they began to discuss the proposal in earnest, debating its merits and potential pitfalls, a new energy filled the room. The challenges of the past weeks had been immense, but they had also opened up possibilities that once seemed unimaginable. Outside, the sun was setting over Los Angeles, casting a warm glow over the city. From the heights of the financial district to the halls of power in Washington, the aftershocks of the Thornton revelations continued to ripple outward. And at the epicenter of it all, in a mansion that had once been a symbol of oppression and was now a beacon of hope, a family looked to the future, scarred but unbroken, tested but undefeated. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with both promise and peril. But for Catherine Thornton, who had already faced her darkest fears and emerged victorious, it was a road she was finally ready to travel, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as the architect of her own destiny. As night fell over the city, the lights of the Thornton mansion blazed bright, a testament to the enduring power of truth, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The imposing facade of the United States Capitol loomed before Catherine and Maxwell as their car pulled up to the curb. Flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions as the Thornton siblings emerged, presenting a united front in the face of the media frenzy. "Are you ready for this?" Maxwell asked quietly as they mounted the steps, his hand supportive at Catherine's elbow. Catherine took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Inside, the halls buzzed with activity. Aides rushed back and forth, their arms laden with documents. Politicians huddled in corners, their hushed conversations falling silent as Catherine and Maxwell passed by. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them both. As they were led into the hearing room, Catherine's eyes widened at the sight of the packed gallery. Cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every moment. At the front of the room, the members of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs sat in stern judgment, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Sullivan," Senator Hawkins, the committee chair, began, "thank you for agreeing to appear before us today. The revelations you brought to light have shaken the very foundations of our financial system. We hope that your testimony will help us understand the full scope of this corruption and guide us in preventing such abuses in the future." Maxwell stepped up to the microphone first, his voice clear and confident as he laid out the facts of their investigation. He detailed the complex web of offshore accounts, the manipulated contracts, the kickbacks and bribes that had flowed through the highest levels of finance and government. As Maxwell spoke, Catherine watched the faces of the senators. Some looked shocked, others angry, and a few— was that fear she saw in their eyes? She couldn't help but wonder how many of them might have their own skeletons in the closet, their own questionable deals that might not stand up to scrutiny. When it was Catherine's turn to testify, she felt a moment of panic. But then she thought of all the people who had been hurt by this corruption, all the lives ruined by greed and abuse of power. She thought of her own journey, from victim to survivor to advocate. Drawing strength from these thoughts, she began to speak. "Senators, distinguished guests," Catherine started, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I come before you today not just as Catherine Thornton, but as a voice for all those who have been silenced by abuse, manipulation, and corruption. My story is just one thread in a tapestry of deceit that stretches across our nation and beyond." As Catherine recounted her experiences, the gradual erosion of her freedom, the manipulation, the forged documents, the room fell into a hushed silence. Even the most hardened politicians seemed moved by her testimony. "But this isn't just about me," Catherine continued, her voice filled with passion. "It's about the countless others who have been victimized by a system that prioritizes profit over people, power over ethics. It's about the urgent need for reform, for true transparency and accountability in our financial institutions and our government." As she concluded her testimony, laying out her vision for a more ethical, transparent financial system, Catherine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had spoken her truth, not just for herself, but for all those who couldn't speak for themselves. The questioning that followed was intense. Senators probed for details, challenged assertions, and sought to understand the full implications of the Thorntons' revelations. Through it all, Catherine and Maxwell stood firm, their responses clear and unwavering. As the hearing drew to a close, Senator Hawkins leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Sullivan, your testimony today has been illuminating, to say the least. I think I speak for the entire committee when I say that the depth and breadth of this corruption is staggering. You can be assured that we will be taking immediate action based on the information you've provided." Outside the hearing room, Catherine and Maxwell faced another barrage of questions from the press. As they made their way through the crowd, Catherine caught sight of a familiar face, Sarah Walker, beaming with pride. "You were amazing in there," Sarah said, embracing her friend. "Both of you. You've really started something big." As they walked out of the Capitol, Catherine felt a surge of hope. They had faced their toughest challenge yet and come out stronger. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real work of reform and rebuilding was still to come. Back at their hotel, as Catherine and Maxwell decompressed from the intensity of the day, Maxwell's phone buzzed with a message. His eyebrows shot up as he read it. "It's from Blackwood," he said, showing the screen to Catherine. "He says he watched our testimony. Wants to meet tomorrow to discuss accelerating the timeline on his proposal." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I think it's time we seriously considered his offer, Max. After what we saw today, it's clear that the system needs more than just a few tweaks. We need to fundamentally reimagine how finance works." As they began to discuss the possibilities, weighing the risks and potential rewards of partnering with Blackwood, neither of them noticed the small blinking light in the corner of the room, a hidden camera capturing their every word. In a darkened room miles away, a figure watched the footage with keen interest. "Well, well," a voice murmured. "It seems the game is far from over. In fact, it might just be getting interesting." As night fell over Washington, the corridors of power buzzed with the aftershocks of the Thorntons' testimony. In boardrooms and backrooms, in the halls of Congress and the offices of regulators, plans were being made, alliances formed and broken. The landscape of power was shifting, and at the center of it all stood Catherine and Maxwell Thornton, unaware that their greatest challenges and greatest triumphs still lay ahead. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the upscale Washington, D.C. hotel suite, finding Catherine already awake, nursing a cup of coffee as she scrolled through the morning's headlines on her tablet. "Thornton testimony rocks Capitol Hill," one headline blared. Financial world braces for sweeping reforms in wake of corruption revelations, declared another. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Maxwell entered, looking as if he'd barely slept. "Ready for round two?" he asked, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Catherine nodded, setting aside her tablet. "As ready as I'll ever be. Any word from Blackwood's people about the meeting location?" Maxwell checked his phone. "Just came through. He wants to meet at the Jefferson Memorial in an hour. Says he values discretion." "The Jefferson Memorial?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Bit dramatic, don't you think?" Maxwell shrugged. "That's Blackwood for you. Always one for theatrics." An hour later, Catherine and Maxwell found themselves standing beneath the imposing dome of the Jefferson Memorial. The early morning tourists paid them little mind as Thomas Blackwood approached, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of the visitors around them. "Maxwell, Catherine," Blackwood greeted them, his voice low. "Quite the performance yesterday. You've certainly set the cat among the pigeons." "Cut the small talk, Thomas," Maxwell said, his patience wearing thin. "You said you wanted to accelerate the timeline. What exactly did you have in mind?" Blackwood's eyes gleamed with excitement. "What I have in mind, my friends, is nothing short of a revolution in finance. Your testimony yesterday has created a unique opportunity. The old guard is in disarray. The public is clamoring for change. The time to strike is now." He produced a tablet from his briefcase, pulling up a series of charts and projections. "I've been working on this plan for years, waiting for the right moment. With your reputation for integrity and my resources, we could create a new kind of financial institution, one built on blockchain technology, ensuring true transparency and accountability." As Blackwood outlined his vision, Catherine found herself both intrigued and wary. The potential was undeniable, a chance to reshape the financial landscape, to create a system that truly served the people rather than exploiting them. But something nagged at her, a sense that there was more to Blackwood's proposal than met the eye. "It's an ambitious plan, Thomas," she said carefully. "But why us? Surely you could have partnered with any number of firms." Blackwood's smile widened. "Because, my dear Catherine, you and your brother have become symbols, the whistleblowers, the reformers, the champions of the people. Your involvement would lend instant credibility to this venture." Maxwell, who had been silently studying the projections, finally spoke up. "And what's in it for you, Thomas? You've never struck me as the altruistic type." Blackwood chuckled. "Always the skeptic, Maxwell. Let's just say that being at the forefront of a financial revolution has its own rewards. I intend to profit, certainly, but in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few." As the siblings exchanged glances, weighing the proposal, Blackwood's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening momentarily before he schooled his features back into a neutral mask. "I'm afraid I must cut this short," he said, tucking the tablet away. "Urgent business calls. But please, take some time to consider my offer. I think you'll find it's the opportunity of a lifetime." As Blackwood strode away, Catherine turned to Maxwell. "What do you think?" Maxwell ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "I think it's a hell of an opportunity, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something Blackwood isn't telling us." Catherine nodded, her own instincts echoing her brother's concerns. "Agreed. We need to do some digging before we commit to anything." As they made their way back to their hotel, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the memorial, a high-powered camera capturing their every move. Back in their suite, Catherine and Maxwell found Sarah waiting for them, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "Have you seen the news?" she asked as soon as they entered. Catherine shook her head, reaching for the remote to turn on the TV. The screen flickered to life, showing a press conference in progress. Richard Sullivan, looking haggard but determined, stood at a podium surrounded by FBI agents. "And so, in accordance with my agreement to cooperate fully with the authorities, I am prepared to name names," Richard was saying, his voice trembling slightly. "What we uncovered is merely the tip of the iceberg. The corruption goes deeper, reaches higher than anyone has imagined." As Richard began to list names, politicians, business leaders, even judges, Catherine felt the room spin. This was it, the final domino falling. The repercussions of this would be felt for years to come. Maxwell's phone began to ring incessantly, notifications flooding in from board members, shareholders, and reporters, all clamoring for comment. Sarah was already on her own phone, coordinating with their legal team to prepare for the inevitable storm of questions and legal challenges. Amidst the chaos, Catherine found herself drawn to the window, looking out over the city. Washington, D.C., the seat of power, now in turmoil because of what they had set in motion. She thought of Blackwood's offer, of the opportunity to build something new from the ashes of the old system. "Kathy," Maxwell's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned to see him holding out his phone, his expression grave. "It's Agent Carlson. He says they found something about Blackwood, something big." As Catherine reached for the phone, her mind racing with possibilities, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of yet another life-altering revelation. The game had changed once again, and the stakes were higher than ever. In a nondescript office building across town, Thomas Blackwood watched the Sullivan press conference with a mixture of frustration and calculation. He picked up his phone, dialing a number known to only a select few. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "Sullivan's singing like a canary. We need to accelerate the plan, yes, all of it. Here it's time to show the Thorntons what real power looks like." As he ended the call, Blackwood turned to gaze out over the city, a slow smile spreading across his face. The pieces were in motion, the endgame approaching, and he intended to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The sun began to set over Washington, casting long shadows across the city. In hotel rooms and offices, in the halls of Congress and the boardrooms of Wall Street, plans were being made, alliances formed and broken. The world was changing, and at the center of it all stood Catherine and Maxwell Thornton, unaware that their greatest test was yet to come. The Thornton suite had been transformed into a makeshift war room. Laptops hummed, papers were strewn across every available surface, and the air was thick with tension. Catherine, Maxwell, and Sarah huddled around a speakerphone hanging on every word from Agent Carlson. "We've been digging into Blackwood's background," Carlson's voice crackled through the speaker. "On the surface, everything checks out, but we've uncovered some discrepancies in his offshore holdings. There's a pattern of transactions that doesn't quite add up." Maxwell leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What kind of transactions are we talking about, Agent?" "Large sums moving through a series of shell companies," Carlson replied. "The trail is complex, but we've traced some of it back to entities we believe are connected to the very network you exposed." Catherine's eyes widened. "Are you saying Blackwood might be involved with the same people we've been fighting against?" "It's too early to say for certain," Carlson cautioned. "But I'd advise extreme caution in any dealings with him. This man is not what he seems." As the call ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah was the first to break it. "So what now? Do we confront Blackwood?" Maxwell shook his head. "Not yet. We need more information. If Blackwood is playing us, we need to understand his endgame." Catherine nodded in agreement. "We also need to be prepared for the fallout from Richard's press conference. The names he dropped. It's going to be chaos." As if on cue, Catherine's phone buzzed with a news alert. She picked it up, her face paling as she read the headline aloud. "Global markets in free fall as corruption scandal widens." Maxwell cursed under his breath. "This is bigger than we anticipated. We need to get ahead of this somehow." Sarah was already typing furiously on her laptop. "I'm drafting a press release now. We need to reassure the public, show that we're part of the solution, not the problem." As they worked to formulate their response, a soft knock at the door made them all jump. Mrs. Abernathy entered, her usually calm demeanor tinged with worry. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Catherine and Maxwell exchanged glances. "Who is it?" Catherine asked. "She says her name is Elena Petrova." The name hit Catherine like a bolt of lightning. Elena, Richard's former secretary, the woman who had disappeared without a trace. "Send her in," Maxwell said, his voice tight with anticipation. Moments later, Elena entered the room. She looked different from the last time Catherine had seen her. Thinner, with dark circles under her eyes. But there was a determination in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Sullivan," Elena began, her accent thicker than Catherine remembered. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced, but there's something you need to know. It's about Thomas Blackwood." As Elena began to speak, unraveling a tale of intrigue and deception that stretched back years, Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Blackwood, it seemed, was far more than just an opportunistic businessman. He was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes of the very corruption they had been fighting against. He was Richard's handler, Elena revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. The one who introduced him to the network, who guided his every move. And now he's trying to position himself as your savior. Maxwell's face hardened. Why are you telling us this now? Why should we trust you? Elena's eyes filled with tears. Because I can't live with the guilt anymore. I was part of it at first, but when I realized the full extent of what was happening, I couldn't stay silent. That's why I disappeared. I've been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to come forward. As Elena produced a flash drive from her purse, promising it contained proof of her claims, Catherine felt a mixture of vindication and dread. They had been right to be suspicious of Blackwood, but the depth of his involvement was staggering. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking ahead. If what Elena's saying is true, we need to move fast. Blackwood will know she's come to us. We're all in danger. Catherine nodded, her mind racing. We need to get this information to Agent Carlson, and we need to prepare for Blackwood's next move. Whatever it is, it won't be pretty. As they began to formulate a plan, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering the most dangerous phase of their fight yet. The enemies they faced were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were out in the open, masquerading as allies. Across town, in a sleek high-rise office, Thomas Blackwood stood at the window, gazing out over the city. His phone buzzed with a message. Petrova has made contact with the Thorntons. Blackwood's lips curled into a cold smile. So, he murmured to himself, the final game begins. He turned to his computer, typing out a series of commands. On the screen, files began to delete themselves. Accounts were closed and new identities were activated. Blackwood had always known this day might come. He was prepared. As night fell over Washington, the city hummed with nervous energy. In the corridors of power, in boardrooms and back alleys, moves were being made. The corruption that had been exposed was fighting back, determined to survive at any cost. And at the center of it all stood Catherine and Maxwell Thornton, armed with the truth but facing their greatest challenge yet. The battle for the soul of the financial world was about to reach its climax, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Little did they know the most shocking revelation was yet to come, one that would test the very foundations of their family and everything they thought they knew about their past. The first rays of dawn were just breaking over the Washington skyline as Catherine Thornton stood at the window of their hotel suite, her mind racing with the revelations of the past 24 hours. Behind her, Maxwell paced the room, speaking in hushed tones on the phone with Agent Carlson. "Understood," Maxwell said, his voice tight. "We'll be there in an hour." As he hung up, Catherine turned to face her brother. "What's the plan?" Maxwell ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Carlson wants us at a secure location. They're setting up a task force to deal with the Blackwood situation. Elena's evidence has opened up a whole new can of worms." Sarah, who had been working tirelessly through the night, looked up from her laptop. "I've finished analyzing the files Elena gave us. It's worse than we thought. Blackwood's tentacles reach into every major financial institution, several governments, even law enforcement agencies." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. How did we not see this before? How did he manage to hide all of this? "Because he's a master of misdirection," a new voice said. They all turned to see Elena standing in the doorway, looking exhausted but determined. Blackwood's true skill isn't in finance or technology. It's in manipulating people, in creating narratives that hide the truth in plain sight. As they prepared to leave for the secure location, Catherine's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her breath caught as she read the headline. "Thomas Blackwood announces revolutionary new financial platform, promises total transparency." "He's making his move," Maxwell said grimly, reading over her shoulder. "Trying to position himself as the solution to the very problem he helped create." Sarah was already typing furiously on her laptop. "I'm reaching out to our media contacts. We need to counter this narrative before it takes hold." As they made their way out of the hotel, flanked by FBI agents, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the eye of a storm. The streets of Washington were eerily quiet, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that something momentous was about to unfold. At the secure location, a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city, they were greeted by Agent Carlson and a team of analysts and investigators. "Welcome to Operation Sunlight," Carlson said, ushering them into a room filled with computers and large screens displaying data and news feeds. "This is where we're going to take down Blackwood and his entire network." As they were briefed on the operation, Catherine's mind whirled with the scope of what they were facing. Blackwood's network was vast, spanning continents and infiltrating the highest levels of government and finance. Taking it down wouldn't just be a matter of exposing the truth, it would require dismantling entire systems of power. "There's something else you need to see," Carlson said, his voice grave. He pulled up a file on one of the screens. "We've been digging into Blackwood's past, trying to understand how he built his empire. We found this." The screen displayed an old photograph, faded and creased. In it, a much younger Thomas Blackwood stood smiling next to a familiar face, Catherine and Maxwell's father. What is this?" Maxwell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carlson's expression was grim. "It seems your father and Blackwood were more than just business acquaintances. We've uncovered evidence that suggests they were partners in the early days of what would become Blackwood's network." Catherine felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Their father, the man they had idolized, the foundation upon which they had built their sense of ethics and integrity, had he been complicit in this web of corruption all along? As the implications of this revelation sank in, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. One of the analysts called out, panic in his voice. "We're under attack. Someone's breached our firewalls." Chaos erupted as the team scrambled to defend against the cyber assault. Screens flickered, data scrolled past at dizzying speeds, and in the midst of it all, a message appeared. "Did you really think you could outmaneuver me? This is just the beginning." "TB." Catherine and Maxwell exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. This was no longer just about exposing corruption or reforming the financial system. This was personal. "We need to go on the offensive," Catherine said, her voice filled with a steely determination. "Blackwood thinks he has us on the run, but he's just shown his hand. We know his game now." Maxwell nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "We use his own tactics against him. If Blackwood is a master of narrative, then we create a narrative he can't control." As they began to outline their counter-strategy, weaving together the threads of finance, media, and public opinion, Catherine felt a surge of energy. They had been reactive for too long, always one step behind. Now it was time to take the lead. Across the city, in a hidden command center of his own, Thomas Blackwood watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of amusement and grudging respect. "Well played, Thorntons," he murmured to himself, "but you have no idea what you're really up against." He turned to a bank of screens, each displaying a different aspect of his vast network. With a few keystrokes, he set in motion a series of contingency plans, deadman switches and fail-safes designed to protect his empire at all costs. As Blackwood prepared for the next phase of his grand design, a small notification popped up on one of his screens. His eyes widened as he read it, a rare flash of genuine surprise crossing his face. Well, he said softly. "It seems the game has changed yet again. Time to welcome an unexpected player to the board." Night fell over Washington, but there was no rest for those embroiled in this high-stakes battle. In secure rooms and hidden bunkers, in the corridors of power and the depths of cyberspace, moves and countermoves were being made. The Thornton siblings, once naive players in a game they didn't fully understand, had become formidable opponents. But as they prepared to take on Blackwood and his network, they were unaware of the final, shocking twist that awaited them. A revelation that would shake the very foundations of their family and force them to question everything they thought they knew about their past, their present, and their future. The endgame was approaching, and the fate of not just a family or a company, but of entire systems of power hung in the balance. The secure facility hummed with activity as Catherine, Maxwell, and their team worked tirelessly to unravel Blackwood's network. Screens flickered with data streams, analysts pored over financial records, and the air was thick with tension and determination. Catherine stood before a large digital map, tracing the connections between Blackwood's various shell companies and front organizations. Her mind, however, kept drifting back to the photograph of her father with Blackwood. "Kathy," Maxwell's voice broke through her reverie, "we need to talk about Dad." She turned to face her brother, seeing her own turmoil reflected in his eyes. "I know," she said softly. I can't believe it." "Everything we thought we knew," Maxwell nodded grimly. "I've been going through some of Dad's old files. There's more." He led Catherine to a secluded corner of the room, away from prying eyes and ears. From his briefcase, he produced a worn leather journal. "I found this hidden in a false bottom of Dad's old desk. It's his personal journal." With trembling hands, Catherine opened the journal. As she began to read, her eyes widened in shock. Their father's elegant handwriting told a tale of idealism turned to disillusionment, of a young man who had entered the world of finance with dreams of changing the system from within, only to be slowly corrupted by the very forces he had sought to reform. "He was in deep," Maxwell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But look at the last few entries." Catherine flipped to the final pages. There, in increasingly frantic scrawls, were their father's plans to break away from Blackwood, to expose the corruption he had become entangled in. The final entry, dated just days before his sudden passing, read, "I can't let this be my legacy. Catherine Maxwell, if you're reading this, know that I tried to make it right. The proof is in the..." The sentence cut off abruptly, leaving a tantalizing mystery. "The proof is in the what?" Catherine asked, frustration edging her voice. Maxwell shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it was, I bet Blackwood knows. This could be the key to bringing him down." As the siblings pondered this new development, Sarah burst into their secluded corner, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this," she said, gesturing for them to follow. Back in the main room, all eyes were fixed on the central screen. A news broadcast was playing, showing Thomas Blackwood at a press conference. His usual smooth demeanor seemed slightly ruffled as he addressed the cameras. "And so, in light of recent events, I believe it is crucial that we embrace a new era of transparency in finance," Blackwood was saying. "That is why I am announcing the launch of ClearSight, a revolutionary blockchain-based platform that will make every transaction, every deal, fully visible and accountable." Catherine and Maxwell exchanged glances. This was Blackwood's countermove, positioning himself as the solution to the very problem he had helped create. "He's trying to get ahead of the story," Maxwell muttered. "If he can paint himself as the reformer, it'll be that much harder to expose him." But Catherine's attention was caught by something else. In the background of the shot, partially obscured but unmistakable, was a familiar face, Elena Petrova. "What is she doing there?" Catherine gasped. Before anyone could respond, Elena stepped forward, approaching the podium. Blackwood's face registered a moment of surprise before he smoothly invited her to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Elena began, her accent thicker than usual. "I stand before you today as someone who has seen the darkness in our financial system, who has been complicit in its corruption. But today I choose to step into the light." The room fell silent as Elena began to speak, detailing years of financial manipulation, of deals made in the shadows. With each word, Blackwood's composure visibly crumbled. "She's exposing everything," Sarah breathed. "But why now? Why like this?" As if in answer, Eleanor turned to face the camera directly. "Catherine, Maxwell, if you're watching this, know that this is for you, for your father. The proof is in the portrait." With those words, chaos erupted. Blackwood lunged for Elena, security swarmed the stage, and the feed cut out abruptly. In the secure facility, a moment of stunned silence was broken by Maxwell's sharp intake of breath. "The portrait," he said. "Dad's portrait in the study. It's been there all along." Catherine was already moving, barking orders to the team. "We need to get to the mansion now, and someone get Agent Carlson on the line. Tell him to move on Blackwood immediately." As they prepared to leave, Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she read it. "Well played, my dear. But remember, in chess, the queen is the most powerful piece. See you soon. V." Catherine showed the message to Maxwell, a new worry creasing her brow. Vanessa, but she's supposed to be in custody." Maxwell's face hardened. "It seems we have another player in the game. Come on, we need to move." As they rushed out of the facility, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing not just against Blackwood, but against time itself. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but with each revelation, the stakes grew higher. Across the city, in a luxurious penthouse, a woman watched the unfolding events on multiple screens. Vanessa, her beauty undiminished by her time in hiding, smiled coldly as she saw the Thorntons spring into action. "That's right," she murmured. "Run along, little pawns. The real game is just beginning." She turned to a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. "Is everything in place?" The figure nodded silently. Vanessa's smile widened. "Excellent. It's time to show Blackwood, the Thorntons, and the world what real power looks like." As night fell over Washington, the city buzzed with the aftershocks of Elena's revelation. But in the shadows, in hidden rooms and secret meetings, the true battle was just beginning. The fate of not just a family or a company, but of entire systems of power, hung in the balance. And racing through it all, unaware of the full scope of the forces arrayed against them, Catherine and Maxwell Thornton sped towards a confrontation that would change everything. The Thornton mansion loomed before them, its familiar silhouette now ominous in the gathering dusk. Catherine and Maxwell approached cautiously, flanked by a team of FBI agents led by Agent Carlson. "Remember," Carlson warned, "we don't know what we're walking into." Blackwood could have people here already. Catherine nodded grimly, her hand instinctively reaching for the comforting presence of her brother beside her. As they entered the foyer, the house seemed to hold its breath, shadows lurking in every corner. "The study," Maxwell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad's portrait is there." They moved swiftly through the house, every creak of the floorboards setting their nerves on edge. As they reached the study door, Catherine paused, her hand on the knob. "Ready?" she asked, looking at Maxwell. He nodded, steeling himself. "Let's finish this." The door swung open, revealing the familiar space, the leather chairs, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and there, above the fireplace, their father's portrait. But they weren't alone. "Welcome home, darlings," a silky voice purred from the shadows. Vanessa stepped into the light, as elegant and deadly as ever. "I've been expecting you." Before anyone could react, the room erupted into chaos. FBI agents swarmed in, guns drawn, but Vanessa merely smiled, raising a small device in her hand. "I wouldn't, if I were you," she said calmly, "unless you want to trigger some rather nasty surprises I've left around the city." Agent Carlson signaled his team to stand down, his face a mask of frustration. "What do you want, Vanessa?" Her laugh was like ice. "Want? My dear agent, I want what I've always wanted, everything. But for now I'll settle for what's hidden in that portrait." Catherine's mind raced. How did Vanessa know about the portrait? And where was Blackwood in all of this? As if reading her thoughts, Vanessa's smile widened. "Oh, Thomas sends his regrets. He's a bit tied up at the moment. It seems Elena's little performance didn't go quite as planned." Maxwell stepped forward, his voice hard. "Enough games, Vanessa. Whatever you're planning, it's over. The whole world knows about the corruption now." Vanessa's eyes flashed dangerously. "You naive boy. Do you really think exposing a few dirty deals changes anything? The system doesn't break that easily. It adapts. It evolves. And those who understand that, those who can ride the wave of change, they're the ones who truly win." As Vanessa spoke, Catherine's eyes darted around the room, looking for any advantage. That's when she saw it, a nearly imperceptible nod from Agent Carlson. In that instant, she understood. They were playing for time. "If you're so confident," Catherine said, drawing Vanessa's attention, "why don't you tell us your grand plan? Isn't that what all the great villains do?" Vanessa laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, Catherine, always the idealist. Very well, let me educate you." As Vanessa launched into a monologue about power dynamics and financial manipulation, Catherine saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Agent Carlson's team was slowly, imperceptibly, maneuvering into position. "And that's why," Vanessa was saying, "with the information in that portrait and Blackwood's network under my control, I'll be able to reshape the entire global financial system. A new world order, with me at its head." "There's just one problem with your plan," Maxwell interjected, a hint of triumph in his voice. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what's that?" "You talk too much," Catherine said, just as all hell broke loose. In a coordinated move, the FBI team sprang into action. Vanessa's hand flew to her device, but before she could activate it, a well-aimed shot from Agent Carlson sent it flying from her grasp. As Vanessa was subdued, Catherine and Maxwell raced to the portrait. With trembling hands, they lifted it from the wall, revealing a safe behind it. The combination, Maxwell muttered, his mind working furiously. What would Dad have used? Catherine's eyes widened in realization. Our birthdays, she said, quickly spinning the dial. 07 to 22, 10, 15. With a soft click, the safe swung open. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note. To my children, the truth and the power to make it right. As Catherine clutched the drive, a wave of emotion washing over her, the room filled with the sounds of agents securing the scene. Vanessa, now in handcuffs, glared at them with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. You've won this round, she spat. But don't think this is over. There are forces at play beyond your comprehension. Agent Carlson stepped forward, his face grim. Save it for the interrogation room, Vanessa. You've got a lot of explaining to do. As Vanessa was led away, Catherine turned to Maxwell, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. What do you think is on this? She asked, her voice hushed. Maxwell shook his head, his expression a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. I don't know. But whatever it is, it was important enough for Dad to hide it all these years. Important enough for Blackwood and Vanessa to chase after. Catherine nodded, a determined look settling over her features. Then let's find out what secrets it holds. It's time to finish what Dad started. As they prepared to leave the mansion, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked. With a sense of foreboding, she answered. Impressive work, Ms. Thornton, a distorted voice said. But I'm afraid your journey is far from over. The game is changing and you've just become a key player. Watch your step. The line went dead, leaving Catherine staring at her phone in shock. She turned to Maxwell, her face pale. I think we've just been recruited into something bigger than we could have imagined. Maxwell's expression hardened. Then we face it together. Whatever comes next, we're in this as a family. As they walked out of the mansion, the USB drive safely in their possession, Catherine and Maxwell knew that this was not an end, but a new beginning. The corruption they had exposed, the network they had disrupted, it was just the tip of the iceberg. In offices and boardrooms, in the shadowy corners of the internet and the corridors of power, forces were aligning. The game was indeed changing, evolving into something far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. But as the Thornton siblings stepped into the uncertain future, they carried with them the strength of their bond, the legacy of their father, and a determination to see justice done no matter the cost. The night was deep, but dawn was coming, and with it, a new chapter in their ongoing saga, one that would test their resolve, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately shape the future of not just their family, but the world itself. The secure room in the FBI headquarters hummed with anticipation as Catherine inserted the USB drive into a specially isolated computer system. Maxwell stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support and shared anxiety. Agent Carlson and a team of cybersecurity experts watched intently, ready to analyze whatever secrets the drive might hold. As the contents of the drive populated the screen, a collective gasp filled the room. Folders upon folders of documents, spreadsheets, and encrypted files stretched out before them, a digital treasure trove of information. My God, Maxwell breathed, his eyes wide. Dad was thorough. Catherine nodded, her throat tight with emotion. He was always meticulous. Even in this, it seems. Agent Carlson leaned in, his brow furrowed. We need to approach this systematically. Miss Thornton, Mr. Thornton, I know this is personal for you, but we need to treat this as evidence in an ongoing investigation. Catherine and Maxwell exchanged a glance, then nodded their agreement. As the FBI team began to sift through the files, the siblings found themselves drawn to a document simply titled 4K&M. With trembling hands, Catherine opened the file. Their father's words filled the screen. My dear Catherine and Maxwell, if you're reading this, then I've failed to make things right in my lifetime. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on your shoulders, but I know you have the strength and integrity to finish what I started. What you'll find on this drive is the culmination of years of investigation. It details a network of corruption that spans governments, corporations, and financial institutions across the globe. I was part of it, I'm ashamed to say. I thought I could change things from the inside, but I only ended up compromising my own values. Blackwood was my partner in the beginning. We had dreams of reshaping the financial world, of creating a more equitable system. But power corrupts, and Thomas was corrupted absolutely. What began as idealism twisted into a quest for control and wealth at any cost. I've included everything you need to expose this network. Bank records, communication logs, details of shell companies and hidden assets. But be warned, this information is dangerous. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep it buried. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I beg you, finish what I started. Bring this system of corruption down, but above all, stay true to yourselves and to each other. Your bond as siblings, as family, is your greatest strength. I love you both, more than I can ever express. I'm sorry I won't be there to see the better world I know you'll create. Always your loving father, Jonathan Thornton. As Catherine finished reading, tears streaming down her face, Maxwell pulled her into a tight embrace. The weight of their father's confession, his expectations, and the magnitude of the task before them settled over them like a heavy cloak. Ms. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, Agent Carlson's voice cut through their emotional moment. I think you need to see this. They turned to see a large screen displaying a complex web of connections, companies, individuals, and financial transactions, all interlinked in an intricate dance of corruption. Your father's data is unprecedented, one of the cybersecurity experts explained, her voice filled with awe. It's not just about Blackwood or even your company. This network touches every major financial institution, several governments, even intelligence agencies. Maxwell's eyes narrowed as he studied the display. Some of these names, they're people currently leading anti-corruption efforts, senators, regulators, even judges. Catherine nodded grimly. The perfect cover. Who would suspect the ones supposedly fighting corruption? As the implications of their discovery sank in, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. Red warning lights flashed as panicked shouts filled the air. We're under attack, one of the technicians yelled. Someone's trying to breach our firewalls. Agent Carlson sprang into action, barking orders to his team. Lock it down, isolate the system. In the chaos, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming message. Her blood ran cold as she read it. Did you really think it would be that easy? The game is just beginning. TB. She showed the message to Maxwell, whose face hardened with determination. He's scared, Maxwell said. We've got him on the run. As the FBI team fought to repel the cyber attack, Catherine and Maxwell huddled together, their minds racing with the enormity of what they'd uncovered and the challenges that lay ahead. What do we do now? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell squeezed her hand reassuringly. We do what Dad asked. We finish what he started. But we do it our way. Catherine nodded, a steely resolve settling over her features. Together. As the alarms continued to blare and the facility buzzed with frantic activity, the Thornton siblings stood united, ready to face whatever came next. They had the truth, they had each other, and they had a mission. Little did they know, their discovery had set in motion events that would shake the foundations of global power. In hidden boardrooms and secret government facilities around the world, emergency meetings were being called. The Thornton siblings had just become the most dangerous people on the planet. To some, a threat that needed to be eliminated. To others, a beacon of hope in a corrupt world. The stage was set for a battle that would span continents, challenge the very nature of finance and governance, and test the limits of family, loyalty, and justice. The Thorntons had opened a digital Pandora's box, and the forces of corruption would stop at nothing to close it. But Catherine and Maxwell were ready. The legacy of their father, the strength of their bond, and their unwavering commitment to the truth would be their weapons in the war to come. The world was about to change, and they were at the heart of the storm. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. The Thornton siblings found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of briefings, strategy sessions, and security measures. The contents of their father's USB drive had set off a chain reaction that was reverberating through the halls of power across the globe. Catherine stood before a wall of screens in a hastily assembled command center, watching as news reports from around the world streamed in. Markets were in turmoil, governments were issuing frantic denials, and protests were erupting in major cities. It's chaos out there, she murmured, her voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. Maxwell joined her, his face etched with concern. And it's only going to get worse before it gets better. We've opened Pandora's box, Kathy. There's no closing it now. Agent Carlson approached, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. We've got a situation, he said grimly. Several key witnesses have gone dark, and we're getting reports of unusual financial activities, massive transfers, accounts being emptied. They're going to ground, Maxwell realized, trying to hide their assets before we can freeze them. Catherine's mind raced, recalling patterns she'd seen in the data from the USB drive. We need to move faster. Every minute we delay gives them more time to cover their tracks. As if in response to her words, one of the technicians called out, "We've got a hit. One of the shell companies identified in the Thornton data just made a large transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands." "Track it," Carlson ordered. "I want to know where every penny ends up." While the FBI team scrambled to follow the money trail, Catherine pulled Maxwell aside. "We can't just play defense," she said in a low voice. "We need to take control of the narrative before Blackwood or someone else does." Maxwell nodded, understanding immediately. "You're thinking of going public? It's risky, Kathy. We'd be painting targets on our backs." "We already have targets on our backs," Catherine countered. "At least this way we control the message. We tell the world the truth, all of it." After a moment's hesitation, Maxwell agreed. "You're right. But we do this smart. We need a platform that can't be easily shut down or discredited." As the siblings began to formulate their plan, Sarah burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this," she said, gesturing to one of the screens. The news feed showed Thomas Blackwood at an emergency press conference, his usual smooth demeanor noticeably ruffled. "And I want to assure the public that these allegations are completely unfounded," Blackwood was saying, his voice strained. "Thornton Enterprises is engaged in a desperate attempt to distract from their own misdeeds. I call on the authorities to investigate." "He's trying to get ahead of the story," Maxwell said, his jaw clenching, "painting us as the villains." Catherine's eyes narrowed as she studied Blackwood's image. "Look at his eyes," she said softly. "He's scared. He knows we have him cornered." Just then, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked. With a sense of déjà vu, she answered, putting it on speaker. "Impressive move, Miss Thornton," the distorted voice from before said. "You've certainly stirred up the hornet's nest. But are you prepared for the swarm?" "Who is this?" Catherine demanded. "What do you want?" A low chuckle came through the speaker. "Let's just say I'm someone who appreciates the game you're playing. But be warned, you're not the only players on this board. Choose your next move carefully." The line went dead, leaving Catherine and Maxwell exchanging worried glances. "Another player," Maxwell mused. "But are they an ally or another enemy?" Before Catherine could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. One of the technicians shouted, "We're under attack!" Multiple breaches detected. Chaos erupted as the FBI team scrambled to defend against the cyber assault. Screens flickered, data scrolled past at dizzying speeds, and in the midst of it all, a message appeared on the main display. "Did you really think you could challenge us and walk away unscathed? This is just a taste of what's to come. Stand down now or face the consequences." "The Guardians." "The Guardians?" Catherine read aloud, her brow furrowed. "Who are they?" Maxwell's face was grim. "I don't know, but it seems we've rattled more than just Blackwood's cage." As the facility buzzed with frantic activity, Catherine and Maxwell huddled together, their minds racing with the implications of this new threat. "We can't back down now," Catherine said, her voice filled with determination. "We owe it to Dad, to ourselves, to see this through." Maxwell nodded, squeezing his sister's hand. "Agreed. But we need to be smart about this. We're not just fighting individuals anymore. We're up against entire systems of power." Just then, Sarah approached, her face pale but resolute. "I think I might have a solution to our platform problem," she said. "I have a contact, an underground journalist with a massive encrypted network. If we can get our story to her, she can blast it out to millions of people simultaneously. No one would be able to stop it." Catherine and Maxwell exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it, the point of no return. "Do it," Catherine said firmly. "It's time the world knew the truth." As Sarah hurried off to make the arrangements, the Thornton siblings turned back to the chaos unfolding before them. The facility was a hive of activity, with agents and technicians fighting digital fires on multiple fronts. In that moment, Standing amidst the storm they had unleashed, Catherine and Maxwell felt the weight of their father's legacy, the expectations of a world hungry for justice, and the looming threat of forces they were only beginning to understand. But they also felt something else, a sense of purpose, of righteous determination. They had started this fight, and they would see it through no matter the cost. As the alarms continued to blare, and the world outside roiled with the aftershocks of their revelations, Catherine and Maxwell Thornton stood united, ready to face whatever came next. They had opened Pandora's box, and now they would have to deal with what emerged, both the horrors and the hope. Little did they know their next move would not just change their lives, but potentially the course of history itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would span the globe, challenge the very foundations of power, and test the limits of their resolve. The game had changed, the stakes had never been higher, and the Thornton siblings were right at the heart of the storm. The underground bunker hummed with nervous energy as Catherine and Maxwell Thornton prepared for what could be the most significant moment of their lives. Surrounded by a team of trusted allies, including Sarah and a handful of FBI agents led by Carlson, they were about to unleash a torrent of truth upon the world. Mira Chen, the underground journalist Sarah had contacted, sat at a complex array of computers, her fingers flying over the keyboards as she made final preparations. Her reputation for exposing corruption and protecting her sources had made her a legend in certain circles, and now she was about to facilitate the biggest story of her career. "Are you sure about this?" Maxwell asked, his voice low as he turned to Catherine. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Catherine nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. "We have to, Max. It's what Dad would have wanted. It's what the world needs." As they spoke, Mira's voice cut through the tension. "We're ready, the network is primed, and I've got confirmation from relay points across 6 continents. Whatever you send out will hit every major social media platform, news outlet, and government inbox simultaneously. It'll be impossible to suppress." Catherine took a deep breath, squeezing Maxwell's hand for support. "Let's do this." With a nod from the Thorntons, Mira began the upload. The screens around them came alive with scrolling data, showing the massive information dump as it spread across the globe like a digital tsunami. Emails, financial records, recorded conversations, and detailed explanations of the corrupt network their father had uncovered, all of it now laid bare for the world to see. Names of powerful politicians, business leaders, and even religious figures flashed across the screens, their misdeeds exposed in stark detail. As the upload completed, a deafening silence fell over the bunker. For a moment it seemed as if the whole world held its breath. Then, chaos erupted. Alerts began popping up on every screen. Social media exploded with activity. News tickers scrolled frantically across the bottom of live broadcasts, and phones began ringing off the hook. "It's working," Sarah breathed, her eyes wide as she monitored the global reaction. "It's spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated." Agent Carlson was already on his phone, barking orders. "I want protection details on all the named whistleblowers immediately, and get me a secure line to the director. This goes all the way to the top." As the initial shock wore off, the true magnitude of what they had done began to sink in. Catherine and Maxwell watched in awe as the world reacted to their revelation. Protests erupted in major cities across the globe. Stock markets plummeted as investors panicked. Governments called emergency sessions, and news anchors struggled to keep up with the flood of information. "We've done it," Maxwell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've changed everything." But even as they celebrated this momentous achievement, a new alert caught their attention. Mira's face paled as she read the incoming message. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Someone's launching a massive counterattack. They're trying to discredit the information, flood the net with disinformation, and—" "Oh no, what is it?" Catherine asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Mira turned to them, her expression grave. "They're coming after you. Your personal information, your family history, they're twisting it, trying to paint you as the real villains." As if on cue, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but unmistakably smug. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" the voice taunted. "You've made a grave mistake, Miss Thornton. The Guardians do not take kindly to those who threaten the established order. Prepare yourself. The real battle is about to begin. The line went dead, leaving Catherine and Maxwell exchanging worried glances. They had struck a massive blow against corruption, but in doing so, they had made themselves targets for forces they were only beginning to understand. As alarms began to blare throughout the bunker, signaling another wave of cyber attacks, the Thornton siblings steeled themselves for what was to come. They had unleashed the truth, and now they would have to face the consequences, both the triumphs and the trials that lay ahead. The world was changing, power structures were crumbling, and at the center of it all stood Catherine and Maxwell Thornton, ready to fight for the future they believed in, no matter the cost. As the world reeled from the Thorntons' revelations, Catherine and Maxwell found themselves at the eye of a global storm. The underground bunker, once a haven of secrecy, now buzzed with frantic activity as they struggled to stay ahead of the chaos they had unleashed. Screens lined the walls, each displaying a different facet of the unfolding drama. News channels from around the world competed for the most shocking headlines. Social media feeds scrolled by in a blur of outrage and disbelief, and financial tickers showed markets in freefall. London Stock Exchange has suspended trading, Sarah reported, her eyes glued to one of the monitors. New York and Tokyo are on the brink of following suit. Maxwell nodded grimly. It's going to get worse before it gets better. We knew this would shake the foundations of the global economy. Catherine, who had been poring over incoming data, suddenly straightened. We've got movement. Several of the key players we identified are trying to flee. Private jets taking off from airports around the world. Agent Carlson was immediately on his phone. I want those planes grounded. Coordinate with Interpol and local authorities. No one on our list leaves their country. As the FBI team scrambled to intercept the fleeing corrupt officials, a new alert flashed across the main screen. Mira's fingers flew across her keyboard as she fought to contain the threat. It's the Guardians, she said, her voice tense. They're launching a coordinated disinformation campaign. Social media bots, deepfake videos, fake news sites. They're pulling out all the stops to discredit us. Catherine leaned in, watching as false narratives about her family began to spread across the internet. They're trying to paint us as the real criminals, she said, her voice tight with anger, claiming we fabricated everything to cover up our own misdeeds. Maxwell put a comforting hand on her shoulder. We knew they'd fight back, but the truth is on our side. We just need to stand firm. As if in response to his words, Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood run cold. You've made a grave mistake, Thorntons. The old world is dying, but what rises from its ashes will be of our making, not yours. Enjoy your moment in the sun. The eclipse is coming. TB. Blackwood, Catherine breathed, showing the message to Maxwell. He's not going down without a fight. Before they could discuss the implications of the threat, a commotion at the bunker's entrance caught their attention. Elena Petrova burst in, her face pale and her eyes wide with urgency. Catherine, Maxwell, she gasped, out of breath. You need to see this. She handed them a tablet, queued up to a live video feed. On the screen, Thomas Blackwood stood at a podium, his usual smooth demeanor now charged with a manic energy. My fellow citizens, Blackwood began, his voice ringing with false sincerity, we stand at a crossroads. The Thornton siblings, in their misguided crusade, have unleashed forces they cannot comprehend or control. But where they see chaos, I see opportunity. As Blackwood continued, outlining his vision for a new world order that would rise from the ashes of the old system, Catherine and Maxwell exchanged worried glances. He's positioning himself as the solution, Maxwell said, his voice tight with frustration. Using the chaos we created to seize even more power. Catherine nodded, her mind racing. We need to counter this. We can't let him twist our narrative. But before they could formulate a plan, the bunker was plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow over the suddenly silent room. We're under attack, Mira shouted, her fingers flying over her keyboard. Massive DDoS assault, unlike anything I've ever seen. They're trying to cut us off from the world. As the team scrambled to restore their systems and fend off the digital assault, a new message appeared on the main screen, glowing ominously in the dim light. Did you really think you could challenge the natural order without consequences? The game has changed, Thorntons. Welcome to the new world, a world where truth is what we say it is. The Guardians. In that moment, as alarms blared and shadows danced on the walls, Catherine and Maxwell Thornton realized the true magnitude of what they were up against. They had unleashed a force for change, but in doing so, they had awoken something far more dangerous, a coalition of the corrupt, fighting with every weapon at their disposal to maintain their grip on power. The siblings locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. They had started this fight, and they would see it through no matter the cost. The truth was out there now, spreading like wildfire across the globe. Their job was to ensure it wasn't snuffed out by those who feared its light. As Agent Carlson barked orders and the team fought to regain control of their systems, Catherine and Maxwell began to formulate their next move. The battle for the future of the global financial system, and perhaps for the very nature of truth itself, was only just beginning. The storm they had unleashed was far from over. In fact, they were only now entering its fiercest depths. But armed with the truth, their unshakable bond, and a growing network of allies, the Thornton siblings were ready to face whatever came next. The world was changing, power structures were shifting, and at the heart of it all stood Catherine and Maxwell Thornton, beacons of hope in a sea of corruption, determined to see their father's mission through to the end. As they prepared for the next phase of their fight, neither of them could shake the feeling that the greatest challenges, and perhaps the most shocking revelations, were yet to come. The days that followed were a blur of activity, as Catherine and Maxwell Thornton fought on multiple fronts. They battled the disinformation campaign, worked with authorities worldwide to bring corrupt officials to justice, and raced against time to stabilize the global economy. Their efforts bore fruit. Slowly but surely, the truth began to prevail. Public opinion shifted as more evidence came to light, corroborating the Thorntons' revelations. Protests turned into movements for reform, and governments were forced to take action against the exposed corruption. Thomas Blackwood's attempt to position himself as a savior backfired spectacularly when Elena Petrova came forward with additional evidence, linking him directly to some of the most egregious financial crimes. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now a fugitive, his empire crumbling around him. The mysterious group known as the Guardians proved to be a coalition of powerful individuals, desperate to maintain the status quo. But as their identities were exposed one by one, their influence waned, and their threats became increasingly hollow. Throughout it all, Catherine and Maxwell stood firm, their bond stronger than ever. They became symbols of integrity and courage, inspiring a new generation to demand transparency and accountability. As the dust began to settle, the siblings found themselves standing on the balcony of their family home, looking out over a world forever changed by their actions. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Catherine asked softly. Maxwell squeezed her hand. "I know he would be. We finished what he started. We made a difference." As they stood there, contemplating the future, Catherine's phone buzzed with a message. It was from the mysterious third party who had contacted them throughout their journey. "Well done, Thorntons. You've passed the test. The world needs guardians like you. This isn't the end. It's a new beginning. Stay vigilant. A friend." Catherine showed the message to Maxwell, a mix of confusion and intrigue on her face. "What do you think it means?" Maxwell shook his head, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I think it means our work isn't done. The world will always need people willing to stand up for what's right." As the sun set on this chapter of their lives, Catherine and Maxwell Thornton knew that while they had won a significant battle, the war for transparency and justice was far from over. But they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the truth, their unbreakable bond, and the legacy of their father. The world was changing, and they would be at the forefront, guardians of a new era of accountability and hope. 1 year after the Thornton revelations shook the world, Catherine stood at the podium of the newly established Global Financial Transparency Summit. Representatives from governments, financial institutions, and civil society organizations from around the world filled the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine began, her voice strong and clear, "a year ago we stood on the brink of chaos. Today we stand at the dawn of a new era, an era of transparency, accountability, and true financial justice." As Catherine outlined the progress made and the challenges that lay ahead, Maxwell watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in his chest. The past year had been a whirlwind of change. New regulations had been implemented, corrupt officials had been brought to justice, and a global movement for financial reform had taken root. Thornton Enterprises, under their joint leadership, had become a beacon of ethical business practices. They had implemented blockchain technology to ensure transparency in all their transactions, setting a new standard for corporate accountability. The mysterious friend had remained silent since their last message, but Catherine and Maxwell remained vigilant, always ready for the next challenge. As Catherine concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Maxwell joined her on stage. The siblings stood together, a united front against corruption, their father's legacy alive in their unwavering commitment to justice. "And so," Catherine said, addressing the global audience, "we move forward, not with fear of the unknown, but with hope for a better future. A future where finance serves the many, not the few, where transparency is the norm, not the exception. This is not the end of our journey. It's a new beginning." As they left the stage, Catherine and Maxwell exchanged a knowing look. They had changed the world, but their work was far from over. New challenges would arise, new battles would be fought. But together, they were ready to face whatever the future held. The Thornton legacy had evolved from a tale of corruption and redemption to a beacon of hope for a more just and transparent world. And as Catherine and Maxwell stepped out into the bright sunlight, they knew that the greatest chapters of their story were yet to be written.